high above the Dead Sea, in a landscape so dry and so silent it feels like the surface of another planet. There are caves that held onto a secret for nearly 2,000 years. Inside those caves, wrapped in linen, sealed in clay jars, hidden from soldiers and empires and time itself, were pieces of parchment and papyrus containing something almost unbelievable. Versions of Genesis, versions of the opening story of the Bible that most people alive today have never heard of, never read, and honestly were never really meant to encounter at all. Before we go further, if you're winding down right now, getting cozy, letting this story carry you towards sleep, tell me where you're listening from and what time it is there. I love reading those comments. It's always something like Lisbon at midnight, or Seoul in the early morning, or Toronto right after dinner. All these different time zones drifting off together to the same voice. And if you want to support the show, the best way to do it is simple. Follow along on Spotify, listen there if you can, and if you're enjoying these stories, leave a 5-star review. There's a link in the description. It genuinely helps more than you'd think. Now back to the desert. For centuries, the story of Genesis felt fixed, solid, unchanging. Adam and Eve, Noah and the flood, Abraham and his long journey toward a promise. These stories had been copied, translated, memorized, and passed down through generation after generation, feeling as permanent as the mountains they were supposedly written near. But permanence is often an illusion built from a lack of evidence. And in 1947, that illusion started to crack. In the caves near a place called Qumran, close to the edge of the Dead Sea, ancient manuscripts began to surface. Not just a few pages, hundreds of scrolls and thousands of fragments, some in remarkably good condition, some crumbling into dust the moment they were touched. Among them were copies of biblical texts older than anything scholars had ever held in their hands before, and tucked into that collection were versions of Genesis that didn't always match the Bible we know today. Some passages were longer, some were shorter, some told the same events with slightly different details, different names, different emotional weight, and some manuscripts didn't just retell Genesis, they expanded it dramatically, adding entire scenes, conversations, and mysteries that never made it into later religious canons. Stories of angels descending to earth, stories of miraculous births that terrified the people who witnessed them. Stories that raised uncomfortable questions about where the line between human and divine was supposed to be drawn. Naturally, this raises a big question. Were these expanded, altered versions considered forbidden? Were they suppressed because they were dangerous? Or were they simply one version among many acceptable interpretations circulating in the ancient world? The honest answer is more complicated than a simple yes or no, and it's a question historians are still cautiously working through today. What we do know is that ancient Judaism, before it became the more centralized religious tradition we recognize now, was far less uniform than most people assume. Multiple versions of sacred texts could exist side by side, each community treasuring its own tradition, its own emphasis, its own understanding of the same core story. So tonight, we're going to slow down and walk through this carefully. Not rushing to dramatic conclusions, not exaggerating what the evidence actually shows, but genuinely exploring what these manuscripts contain, how they were discovered, how scholars pieced together fragments smaller than a fingernail, and why some of these Genesis texts feel so unfamiliar compared to the Bible sitting on shelves around the world today. We'll look at shepherds and caves. We'll look at ancient scribes working by lamplight. We'll look at giants, watchers, and reinterpreted creation stories. And slowly, piece by piece, we'll understand why these scrolls change the way historians think about the origins of one of humanity's oldest and most influential stories. But it all starts, as these things often do, with an accident. A boy, a stone, and a cave that had been waiting patiently for almost 2,000 years. The story usually begins with a young Bedouin shepherd named Muhammad Dib, whose name translates roughly to Muhammad the Wolf, which honestly sounds like something out of a folk tale already. According to the most commonly repeated version of events, sometime in late 1946 or early 1947, he was tending goats near the cliffs above the Dead Sea, when one of the animals wandered off, climbing up into the rocky terrain the way goats do when they have absolutely no respect for anyone's schedule. Frustrated, he tossed a stone into a dark opening in the cliffside, hoping to startle the animal out. Instead of a bleating goat, he heard something else. A strange, hollow, shattering sound, the sound of pottery breaking somewhere deep inside the cave. Now, if you're picturing him immediately climbing in with a torch, ready to uncover the greatest manuscript find of the 20th century, that's not quite what happened. Some versions of the story say he was too nervous to go in alone. Other versions say he returned later with a friend. There are accounts that mention him waiting days before working up the courage to investigate further. The truth is, we don't know the exact sequence of events with certainty, because this story wasn't written down by historians in real time. It was pieced together afterward, through interviews, through second-hand accounts, through the kind of storytelling that tends to smooth out its own rough edges the more times it gets repeated. What we do know, or at least what scholars generally agree happened, is that eventually someone climbed into that cave and found clay jars, tall cylindrical containers with lids, arranged in the cool shadowed interior. Inside some of those jars were scrolls, wrapped in linen cloth that had disintegrated at the edges, but still held together in the centre. Ancient, fragile, covered in a script most people in the region couldn't immediately read. This first cave, now simply called Cave 1, would eventually yield 7 relatively complete scrolls, an extraordinary number considering most archaeological finds from this period consist of fragments smaller than a postage stamp. Among these 7 were a nearly complete copy of the Book of Isaiah, a commentary on the Book of Habakkuk, and other texts describing community rules and end times expectations. Genesis material would come later from other caves, but this first discovery was enough to set something enormous into motion. Here's where the story gets messy, in the way that real historical discoveries often do. The Bedouin who found the scrolls weren't scholars. They didn't fully understand what they had. What they understood was that old things could sometimes be sold, and so the scrolls made their way quietly, cautiously, into the hands of antiquities dealers in Bethlehem. One of these dealers, a man known as Kando, would go on to play a recurring role in the scroll trade for years afterward, buying and reselling manuscripts as more caves were found, sometimes cutting fragments apart to sell them piecemeal, which frustrates scholars to this day when they try to reconstruct which fragment belonged to which original scroll. From the dealers, word eventually reached scholars, some associated with the American schools of Oriental research in Jerusalem, others with Hebrew University. This is where the story splits into 2 competing threads, because political tensions in the region in 1947 and 1948 were rising fast. The British mandate in Palestine was ending. War was approaching. Manuscripts were being examined, purchased, and studied under conditions that were anything but stable. Some scrolls ended up in the hands of Israeli scholars. Others ended up abroad, examined and published by different research teams who weren't always coordinating closely with one another. When word of the discovery reached the wider academic world, the response was immediate and, frankly, a little chaotic. Here were manuscripts potentially over 2,000 years old, biblical texts older by nearly 1,000 years than anything previously known to exist. Before this discovery, the oldest known Hebrew biblical manuscripts dated to around the 9th or 10th century of the Common Era. Suddenly, scholars were holding fragments that might reach back to the 3rd or 2nd century before the Common Era, an almost unthinkable leap backward in time. International attention arrived quickly, and understandably so. If these texts contained even slightly different versions of biblical books, they could reshape everything historians thought they understood about how Scripture had been transmitted, copied, and standardized over the centuries. Newspapers picked up the story. Universities scrambled to fund further excavation. And more caves. Eventually 11 in total around the Qumran area would be discovered over the following decade, some by archaeologists conducting deliberate searches, others by local Bedouin who realized, quite reasonably, that ancient scrolls were worth quite a lot of money. It's worth pausing here to acknowledge something important. Much of what we think we know about that very first discovery, the goat, the thrown stone, the shattering jar, comes from retellings collected years after the fact, sometimes decades later, filtered through translation, memory, and a fair amount of dramatic flourish. Historians generally accept the broad outline as plausible, even likely, but they're careful not to treat every detail as verified fact. It's a story shaped as much by memory as by record. What's undisputed is this. In a matter of months, a discovery made almost by accident in one of the driest, most forgotten corners of the ancient world was about to force scholars to reconsider everything they thought they understood about the Bible's earliest history. And Genesis, the very first book, was about to look a lot less settled than anyone had expected. But before we can understand what these manuscripts say, we need to understand where they spent nearly 2,000 years waiting to be found. Because Qumran was not Jerusalem. It was not a great capital crowded with pilgrims, priests, merchants, and Roman soldiers. It was a small, severe place on the northwestern shore of the Dead Sea, pressed between pale limestone cliffs and one of the harshest landscapes in the ancient Near East. Picture the Dead Sea below you, impossibly blue in the right light, but so saturated with salt that almost nothing can live in it. To the west, the Judean wilderness rises in dry folds of rock and gravel. Rain falls rarely. Summer temperatures can become brutal. Fresh water is scarce. Vegetation clings to the ground in scattered stubborn patches. It is the kind of landscape that makes every jar of water, every shaded room, every surviving scrap of parchment feel like an achievement. And yet people lived here. The ruins called Qumran sit on a marl terrace above the Dead Sea, not far from the caves where the scrolls were discovered. Archaeologists excavating the site found the remains of a settlement. Walls, rooms, storage spaces, workshops, cisterns, channels, ovens, and what may have been communal areas. They found pottery in extraordinary quantities. They found a cemetery just east of the settlement, with more than 1,000 graves visible on the surface, and many more suggested beneath the ground. At first glance, Qumran can feel isolated, almost forgotten. But it was not completely cut off from the world. A road ran through the region. The oasis of Ein Gedi lay to the south. Jericho was not impossibly far away. Jerusalem, the religious centre of Jewish life, stood beyond the wilderness hills to the west. Travellers, merchants, soldiers, pilgrims, shepherds, refugees, and fugitives could all have passed through this landscape. The desert was empty in one sense, but connected in another. It was a borderland, a place where people could withdraw from society without vanishing entirely. The scrolls themselves were copied, composed, and stored across a long stretch of time, broadly from around the 3rd century before the Common Era to the 1st century of the Common Era. That means they belong to an age of enormous political change. When some of the earliest manuscripts were being written, the region was ruled by Greek-speaking dynasties descended from Alexander the Great's generals. Later came the Hasmonean kingdom, a Jewish state born out of revolt. Then Roman power arrived, bringing taxation, military force, political maneuvering, and eventually war. This was the world of the Second Temple. The First Temple in Jerusalem, according to biblical tradition, had been destroyed by the Babylonians in 586 BCE. A new temple was later built, expanded and transformed into the center of Jewish worship. By the time many of the Qumran manuscripts were copied, this second temple had stood for centuries. It was magnificent, wealthy, controversial, and deeply important. People travelled great distances to worship there. Sacrifices were offered there. Priests controlled its rituals. Its calendar shaped religious life. And at the same time, many Jews disagreed intensely about who had the right to lead, how the law should be interpreted, when festivals should be observed, and whether the temple establishment itself had become corrupt. This is important, because the people connected to the scrolls did not live in a world with one single version of Judaism, one universally accepted set of beliefs, or one fixed biblical text sitting unchanged on every shelf. There were different groups, different teachers, different priestly families, different calendars, different expectations about the future. Some Jews emphasized temple sacrifice, some focused on strict interpretation of the law. Some lived ordinary lives in villages and towns. Some were drawn to wilderness communities and apocalyptic visions. Some expected God to intervene dramatically in history, defeat the wicked, and restore a purified Israel. Qumran appears to have existed right in the middle of those arguments. But here is where the story becomes complicated. Scholars have debated for decades who exactly lived at Qumran, and whether the people living there were the same people who placed the scrolls in the caves. The traditional answer is that Qumran was home to a Jewish sect, often identified with the Essenes, a group described by ancient writers such as Josephus, Philo, and Pliny the Elder. According to this view, the settlement was occupied by a highly disciplined religious community. Its members may have shared meals, practiced ritual washing, followed a strict internal hierarchy, copied sacred texts, and waited for the end of the present age. Some scrolls seem to describe a community with rules for admission, punishments for misconduct, communal property, and separation from outsiders. These texts speak in the language of purity, covenant, judgment, and expectation. It is easy to see why early scholars connected them with the ruins nearby. The settlement also contains features that seem, at least possibly, consistent with communal religious life. There are numerous water installations, including stepped pools that may have been used for ritual immersion. There is a large room where some scholars believe communal meals may have taken place. There are spaces that may have served as workshops or storerooms. One room contained inkwells, which encouraged the idea that scribes copied manuscripts there. But every piece of that picture has been questioned. Maybe the stepped pools were primarily for storing scarce water, not ritual bathing. Maybe the large room had a more practical purpose. Maybe the inkwells prove only that someone wrote there, which is not quite the same thing as proving Qumran was a monastery-like centre of manuscript production. Maybe the cemetery's population was not exclusively male, as older theories once suggested. Some graves may contain women and children, though the evidence is incomplete and interpretations remain disputed. And then there is the biggest question of all. Were the manuscripts actually the library of the people at Qumran? It sounds obvious now because the caves and ruins are so close together. But proximity is not identity. Some scholars think the scrolls were hidden by the Qumran community as Roman armies advanced during the Jewish revolt of 66 to 70 CE. Others think at least part of the collection may have come from Jerusalem, brought into the wilderness by priests, refugees, or anyone trying to save precious texts before the city fell. Still others argue for a mixed picture. Some manuscripts may have belonged to a local group, while others arrived from elsewhere over time. The evidence allows possibilities. It does not hand us a signed note saying these books belong to the residents of Qumran, and perhaps that uncertainty is fitting. The scrolls are not one neat library assembled by one person on one afternoon. They are a surviving collection from a turbulent age. Some are biblical manuscripts, some are commentaries. Some are prayers, hymns, legal writings, calendars and community rules. Some retell familiar stories in unexpected ways. Some imagine angels, cosmic battles, final judgment, and a future purified world. Together they preserve the arguments, hopes, fears, and obsessions of people living under foreign rule and waiting for history to change. The ruins themselves show a place that changed over time. Qumran was not frozen in one perfect moment. Archaeologists have identified phases of occupation, destruction, rebuilding, and expansion. It may have been damaged by an earthquake around 31 BCE, though the precise effects are still discussed. Later it was occupied again, before the wider catastrophe of the First Jewish Revolt brought Roman armies into Judea. The site seems to have been abandoned or destroyed around 68 CE, when Roman forces moved through the region on their way toward Jerusalem. If the scrolls were hidden during those years, the people who carried them into the caves may have believed they would return. Maybe they wrapped the manuscripts in linen, sealed some in jars, and tucked them into dark chambers above the Dead Sea, with the intention of retrieving them after the danger passed. Maybe they imagined the caves as temporary shelters for words that mattered too much to lose. They did not return, or if some did, they did not recover everything. And so the desert kept them. For nearly 2,000 years, heat, dryness, darkness and chance preserved what would normally have disappeared. Not perfectly. Many scrolls crumbled. Some survived only as fragments. Some were damaged by insects, moisture, human disturbance, and time itself. But enough remained to reveal something historians had long suspected and many readers had forgotten. In the centuries before the Bible became a fixed collection, with a fixed wording, Jewish communities were reading, copying, interpreting, expanding, and sometimes reshaping their sacred traditions in more than one way. At Qumran, beside that silent salt sea, the surviving evidence does not give us one secret Bible hidden from everyone else. It gives us something more interesting. It gives us a world where Scripture was alive. But what does it actually mean to say that Scripture was alive? It means the Dead Sea Scrolls are not one book. They are not one lost gospel, one secret Bible, one forbidden chapter of Genesis, tucked away in a cave until the modern world was ready to be shocked by it. The name makes them sound singular, the Dead Sea Scrolls, as if somewhere in the desert there was one enormous roll of parchment containing all the answers. There wasn't. What survived is a library, a damaged, scattered, incomplete library, preserved in 11 caves near Qumran, and made up of roughly 900 manuscripts, depending on how scholars count separate fragments and copies. Some were written on animal skin, what we call parchment. Some were written on papyrus made from pressed plant fibres. One famous text was engraved on copper, because apparently parchment was not dramatic enough for a list of buried treasures. Most of these manuscripts are not complete scrolls you can unroll from beginning to end. They are pieces, sometimes large pieces, with columns of carefully written text still visible. Sometimes scraps no larger than a fingernail, a corner containing 3 letters, a line with half a word, a fragment of parchment darkened by age, folded, broken, stained, and almost impossible to read without patient work. So when someone says, "The Dead Sea Scrolls say," that sentence needs a little caution. Which scroll, which copy, which fragment? Is the text complete? Is the reading certain? Is the manuscript original to Qumran? Or was it brought there from somewhere else? The answers can change the story, and that is part of what makes this collection so fascinating. These are not polished books preserved in a royal archive. They are survivors. They come to us through accident, decay, and a long chain of people making decisions under pressure. Someone copied them. Someone read them. Someone repaired some of them. Someone stored them. Someone, perhaps in a moment of fear, as war approached, carried at least some of them into caves and left them there. Then time did the rest. The library contains manuscripts of books that later became part of the Hebrew Bible. Genesis is there. So are Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, Isaiah, Psalms, Job, Proverbs, and many others. Nearly every book in the Hebrew Bible is represented in some form. The major exception is Esther, though absence from the caves does not necessarily mean nobody at Qumran knew or valued it. A surviving collection is not the same thing as a complete inventory. What remains tells us what chance allowed to remain. But biblical manuscripts are only part of the story. There are also community rules, texts laying out how a group should admit new members, organize meals, punish misconduct, handle property, and separate itself from people it considered spiritually compromised. There are prayers and hymns, some written in an intensely personal voice, full of humility, struggle, gratitude, and fear before the overwhelming power of God. There are commentaries too, not commentaries in the modern sense, with footnotes and academic arguments, but writings that take passages from biblical prophets and interpret them as messages about the writer's own time. A verse from Habakkuk or Isaiah might be quoted, then explained as a prophecy about wicked rulers, false teachers, a faithful community, or the final struggle between light and darkness. Imagine reading an ancient prophecy and being completely convinced it was not primarily about the distant past. It was about you, your enemies, your crisis, your generation standing at the edge of history. That feeling runs through many of the Qumran texts. There are legal writings discussing purity, marriage, sacrifice, festivals, and the calendar. There are texts about angels and demons. There are collections of blessings and curses. There are writings describing an expected final war, with the sons of light fighting the sons of darkness. There are rewritten versions of familiar biblical stories, where older traditions are expanded, clarified, rearranged, or placed inside a larger cosmic plan. And there are works that were widely read by some Jewish communities in the ancient world, but did not become part of the Hebrew Bible as later Jewish tradition defined it. Books such as Jubilees and 1 Enoch appear again and again in the world of the scrolls. Their presence reminds us that ancient readers did not always draw the boundaries of sacred literature in exactly the way later generations would. That does not mean anything was a free-for-all. These people clearly cared deeply about authority. They argued about the right law, the right calendar, the right priesthood, the right interpretation of Scripture, the right way to prepare for God's judgment. But the shape of the library shows that authority could work differently than many modern readers expect. A text could be deeply respected without being part of one final, universally agreed collection. A biblical story could be retold without its reteller necessarily believing he was overthrowing Scripture. A copy of a familiar book could differ in small ways from another copy, without anyone seeing that difference as a disaster. The scrolls were written mainly in Hebrew and Aramaic, the two great languages of Jewish life in this period. Hebrew was the language of much biblical tradition, prayer, law, and literary composition. But it was not frozen in the distant past. People were still writing in Hebrew, though the Hebrew of the scrolls sometimes looks different from the classical style found in older biblical books. Aramaic was also everywhere. It had become a major language of everyday life and administration across much of the Near East long before the scrolls were copied. Some of the most imaginative writings in the collection are in Aramaic. Stories about patriarchs, visions, giants, heavenly beings, and ancient heroes move through this language. Then there is Greek. Greek appears much less often in the Qumran caves, but its presence matters. The Eastern Mediterranean after Alexander the Great was a Greek-speaking world in many ways. Greek cities, Greek rulers, Greek trade, Greek education, Greek legal language, Greek books. Jewish communities did not exist outside that world. Even in a desert library beside the Dead Sea, the wider Mediterranean was never very far away. This multilingual setting matters because it reminds us that the people behind these manuscripts were not isolated relics from some sealed-off biblical universe. They were living in a complicated age. They inherited ancient Hebrew traditions. They spoke and wrote Aramaic. They lived under kingdoms shaped by Greek culture and then Roman power. They argued about scripture while moving through a world of changing languages, armies, markets, temples, and empires. And not every scroll was secret. This is one of those ideas that sounds exciting because it turns archaeology into a conspiracy. Hidden caves, forbidden texts, lost knowledge. A version of Genesis powerful people supposedly buried because nobody was meant to read it. The reality is stranger and much more human. Some texts may indeed have been restricted to members of a particular community. A rulebook meant for an inner group was probably not read aloud in every village marketplace. Some writings may have seemed dangerous, controversial, or too sacred for casual handling. Ancient people had their own boundaries around knowledge. They had insiders and outsiders, teachers and initiates, public traditions and private interpretations. But hiding a manuscript in a cave during a war is not the same as declaring it forbidden forever. Most likely, many of these texts were ordinary working manuscripts before they became buried treasures. They were copied to be read. Some were used so heavily that they show wear, repairs, corrections, and marks left by readers. They had lives before the caves. They belonged to communities of people who studied, prayed, debated, and disagreed. Nor should we imagine that every manuscript was written by one isolated desert sect, sitting in a silent room and producing its own strange alternative Bible. Some texts do seem closely connected to a particular community, perhaps the people who lived at Qumran, or people who shared their beliefs. But other manuscripts look like copies of widely circulating Jewish writings. Some may have come from Jerusalem or other places in Judea. The caves may preserve the library of one group, or a collection assembled from several sources, or something in between. The evidence is rich. It is not neat. That is why the Dead Sea Scrolls matter so much. They do not hand us a single hidden truth that replaces everything people thought they knew. They show us the texture of a world before later boundaries hardened. A world where Genesis could be copied in Hebrew, retold in Aramaic, interpreted through new stories, and read beside writings about angels, calendars, purity, and the end of time. And once you understand that the scrolls are a library, not a single revelation, the next question becomes unavoidable. What did a library like this tell us about the Bible itself, before there was one fixed text that everyone agreed was the only text? The answer begins with a simple fact that is easy to forget, because modern books make us forget it. In the ancient world, a text was not a file. There was no master copy stored in the cloud. No printing press producing 10,000 identical editions. No publisher sending out a corrected version and quietly removing last year's mistake from every shelf. If you wanted a copy of Genesis, someone had to sit down with a scroll, ink, a reed pen, and a fresh piece of parchment or papyrus and write it out by hand. Letter by letter, line by line, often for hours at a time. And copying by hand is an astonishing human achievement. It is also a very human process. A scribe could be careful, educated, devout, and fully convinced that every word mattered, yet still make a mistake. Eyes skip from one repeated word to another. A line gets copied twice. A word is misspelled. A familiar phrase is written in the form the scribe knows best. A damaged or faded exemplar forces a guess. A margin note originally meant as an explanation gets absorbed into the text by a later copyist. None of this requires fraud. None of it requires a conspiracy in a candle-lit room. It requires only tired eyes, similar letters, difficult handwriting, and generations of people doing their best to preserve something precious. Think of a scribe copying a scroll by lamplight. He has before him an older manuscript, perhaps already copied many times. The leather is worn, the ink has faded in places, a crease runs through a line. He reads a word that could mean one thing or another. Maybe he knows a fuller form from recitation. Maybe his teacher used slightly different spelling. Maybe he corrects what seems to him like an obvious slip. Then his copy becomes the manuscript another scribe will use decades later. This is how texts travel through time, not as perfectly identical objects, but as family lines. And like families, manuscripts resemble one another without being exactly the same. That is what scholars mean by textual variation. It sounds alarming when you first hear it, as if every ancient book is falling apart into chaos. But variation is normal wherever texts are copied by hand. Greek poems have it, Roman histories have it, ancient legal documents have it. The Bible has it too. Most variations are small, very small. One manuscript spells a word in a fuller way, another uses a shorter spelling. Hebrew writing in the period of the Dead Sea Scrolls was not always standardized in the way a modern printed Bible is standardized. A word might be written with an extra letter to make its vowel sound clearer, or without it, to an ancient reader. The difference may have been barely noticeable. To a modern scholar, it can be a useful clue about language, date, scribal habit, or the route a manuscript took before it reached a cave. Other differences involve grammar or wording. One copy might say all the sons of Israel, while another says simply the sons of Israel. One manuscript may use a familiar expression where another preserves an older or less common one. Sometimes a sentence appears in a slightly different order. Sometimes a passage has been expanded for clarity. Sometimes it has been shortened, whether deliberately or by accident. And then there are differences that are not merely about copying, but about interpretation. Ancient readers did not always treat interpretation as something kept safely outside the sacred text. A writer retelling a biblical story could explain what was only implied. He could make a timeline clearer. He could identify a mysterious figure. He could connect one event to another. He could arrange the story in a way that revealed what he believed was its deeper meaning. To us, that can look like changing the text. To some ancient writers, it may have looked more like making the text speak clearly. This is where modern expectations can get in the way. Many readers grow up imagining that there was always one perfectly fixed version of Genesis, identical in every synagogue, every village, every century, waiting patiently to be printed in a modern Bible. The surviving evidence suggests a more complicated picture. There were certainly texts treated with enormous reverence. There were scribes who copied them with great care. There were communities that argued fiercely about the right wording of the law and the right interpretation of Scripture. But the period before and during the Dead Sea Scrolls seems to have contained more than one textual form of some biblical books. Not endless confusion, not an anything-goes world where every person invented a private Bible, but a world in which several related forms of a sacred tradition could circulate side by side. Later Jewish tradition preserved what scholars call the Masoretic text. This is the Hebrew text behind most modern Jewish Bibles and many modern translations of the Old Testament. The surviving complete manuscripts of this tradition are medieval, copied many centuries after Qumran. But the Dead Sea Scrolls show that manuscripts closely related to the later Masoretic form already existed in the ancient period. That matters. It means the Masoretic text did not suddenly appear in the Middle Ages. It has deep roots, but it was not the only root. Another major tradition is the Septuagint, usually shortened to the Greek letters LXX, because ancient legend connected its translation with 70 or 72 translators. The Septuagint was a collection of Jewish scriptures translated into Greek, beginning several centuries before the time of Jesus and continuing over time. It became deeply important for Greek-speaking Jews and, later, for early Christians. The Septuagint is not simply a Hebrew Bible with every word mechanically swapped into Greek. Translation is never that simple. Greek has different grammar, different rhythms, different possibilities. A translator must choose. Does this Hebrew word mean young woman, virgin, maiden, or something else in this particular context? Does a phrase sound natural if translated word for word, or does it need to be reshaped? And sometimes the Greek translation seems to reflect a Hebrew manuscript that differed from the form later preserved in the Masoretic tradition. That is where the Dead Sea Scrolls become especially valuable. In a few cases, Hebrew manuscripts from Qumran resemble readings known from the Greek Septuagint. Suddenly, a Greek difference no longer looks like a translator making an odd choice. It may preserve evidence for an older Hebrew wording that once circulated in Judea. Then there is the Samaritan Pentateuch. The Samaritans preserved their own version of the first 5 books of the Bible: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. Their text is written in a distinctive Samaritan script and reflects the religious life of a community centered on Mount Gerizim rather than Jerusalem. Some of its differences are clearly connected to Samaritan beliefs, especially passages emphasizing Gerizim as the chosen place of worship. But not every difference is uniquely Samaritan. Some readings found in the Samaritan Pentateuch are also echoed in manuscripts from Qumran. That suggests certain features of this textual tradition may be older than the later divide between Jews and Samaritans. Again, the desert caves complicate the simple story. They show us that traditions we once imagined as separate and late sometimes have ancient relatives. So picture the biblical world before one standard printed text. There are Hebrew scrolls copied in different places. There are scribes preserving forms close to what would become the Masoretic text. There are other Hebrew forms that sometimes resemble the Samaritan Pentateuch. There are Greek translations crossing the Mediterranean, carrying scripture into new cities and new languages. There are Aramaic retellings and explanations, helping readers hear ancient Hebrew stories in the language of daily life. There are copies, revisions, translations, interpretations, arguments, and through all of it, Genesis continues to move. The story of creation, Adam and Eve, Cain and Abel, the flood, Abraham leaving his homeland, Sarah laughing, Jacob wrestling in the dark. These stories were already ancient when the Qumran scribes copied them, yet they were not dead words trapped in an untouchable past. They were read as living history, living law, living prophecy, which brings us closer to the manuscripts themselves. Because among the fragments found near the Dead Sea are copies of Genesis. Not one complete secret Genesis, not a replacement for the book people know today, but pieces of a textual world still in motion. And when we look closely at those pieces, the differences become both smaller and more interesting than the legends ever promised. So what did the caves actually give us? Not a leather-bound book. Not a single complete scroll unrolling from in the beginning to the death of Joseph. Not a secret Genesis hidden away because somebody feared what it said. What survived were manuscripts, fragments, sometimes several columns of writing. Sometimes a strip of parchment no bigger than a hand. sometimes a few letters clinging to the edge of a torn piece of skin, enough to identify a familiar verse, but not enough to reconstruct the whole passage around it. Scholars generally identify approximately 24 manuscripts or manuscript fragments of Genesis among the Dead Sea Scrolls. The exact total can sound slightly different depending on how fragments are assigned and whether tiny pieces are counted separately. That uncertainty is not a failure of scholarship. It is part of the reality of the evidence. These were ancient scrolls, broken apart, scattered, moved, buried, and rediscovered almost 2,000 years later. But however you count them, Genesis was clearly well represented at Qumran. That alone tells us something important. Genesis was not an obscure text sitting unnoticed in the corner of a library. It was copied repeatedly, read repeatedly, preserved by a community that seems to have considered the stories of creation, the flood, the patriarchs, and the origins of Israel deeply important. If you wanted to understand the world, human failure, the covenant, the land, family, inheritance, purity, angels, giants, or the strange geography of sacred history, Genesis was where the conversation began. The names scholars give these manuscripts can look intimidating at first. Things like 1Q-gen or 4Q-gen or 4Q-gen. But the code is simpler than it looks. The number at the beginning identifies the cave. So 1Q means Cave 1. That is the first cave made famous by the earliest discoveries, the cave that produced the Great Isaiah Scroll and several other major manuscripts. The letter Q stands for Qumran. Then comes the name of the biblical book. Gen means Genesis. So 1Q-gen means a manuscript of Genesis found in Cave 1 at Qumran. Now take 4Q-gen, same idea. A Genesis manuscript from Cave 4 at Qumran. And 4Q-gen B means something even more revealing. It means there was more than one Genesis manuscript from Cave 4. Scholars needed a way to distinguish them, so they assigned letters. 4Q-gena, 4Q-genb, 4Q-genb, and onward. Each label is not the name of a lost gospel or a forbidden edition. It is basically an archaeological address, cave number, site, book, individual manuscript. A filing system created because the desert had handed modern scholars a puzzle with thousands of pieces. And Cave 4 was the heart of that puzzle. If Cave 1 was the dramatic opening scene, Cave 4 was the warehouse. It was discovered in 1952, and unlike the first cave, it did not contain intact jars holding spectacular near-complete scrolls. Instead, Cave 4 produced an enormous mass of material, tens of thousands of fragments from hundreds of manuscripts. Biblical books, commentaries, rules for community life, hymns, calendars, strange visionary texts, legal writings, retellings of biblical stories, and Genesis fragments. Why were so many of them so small? Partly because of where they had been stored. Cave 4 seems to have held a large collection of manuscripts, perhaps placed there during a time of danger, perhaps accumulated over years, perhaps connected in some way to the nearby settlement. The cave was not a carefully maintained library forever, sealed against time. It was a rough space. Its contents were exposed to age, disturbance, insects, moisture, heat, collapse, and the slow destructive work of centuries. A complete scroll is a fragile thing. A parchment scroll can dry out, curl, crack along its folds, tear where it has been opened and rolled again. Ink can fade, edges can crumble. Once a scroll begins breaking apart, every movement creates more fragments. A manuscript that once held the whole of Genesis can become a cloud of disconnected pieces, its sentences scattered across a cave floor. That is why Cave 4 is so important and so frustrating. It preserved a vast library, but it preserved it in pieces. Imagine trying to identify an ancient book after a storm has ripped it apart, except the paper is 2,000 years old. The handwriting is in ancient Hebrew script, and many scraps contain only part of one word. One fragment might preserve the end of a line from the story of Noah. Another may contain a phrase from the covenant with Abraham. Another might show a genealogy, a place name, or the distinctive wording of a verse known from later copies. The work is patient almost beyond belief. Scholars study the shape of letters, the colour and thickness of parchment, the ruling of lines, the spacing between columns, the way a particular scribe forms certain Hebrew characters. They compare the surviving words with the traditional Hebrew text, with the Samaritan Pentateuch, with ancient Greek translations, and with other manuscripts from the caves. Sometimes the identification is secure. A fragment contains enough distinctive words to place it in a specific chapter and verse. Sometimes it remains uncertain, and sometimes a fragment is so small that it can only whisper that it once belonged to Genesis at all. Collectively, the Qumran Genesis manuscripts preserve portions from across the book's long sweep. There are remains associated with the opening chapters, with the early ancestral stories, with the flood traditions, and with the narratives of Abraham and the later patriarchs. The exact coverage is uneven. Some sections survive in more than one manuscript. Others are represented only by a small surviving piece, or not at all in the material we possess. This is crucial. The caves do not give us one complete alternate Genesis. They do not give us a scroll that begins with a radically different creation story, then leads into a lost flood, then reveals an entirely unknown Abraham. That is the exciting version of the story, the version a dramatic title might make you expect. But the physical evidence is quieter than that, and, in its own way, far more interesting. What Qumran gives us is a collection of witnesses, ancient copies made by different scribes at different times, preserving Genesis in forms that can be compared with one another and with later textual traditions. Some are close to the Hebrew text familiar from modern Bibles. Some contain small differences in spelling or wording. A few may point toward textual families that later became more visible in the Samaritan Pentateuch or Greek translation. But none of the surviving Genesis manuscripts from Qumran preserves an entire competing book. There are no complete alternatives, because there are no complete Qumran copies of Genesis at all. Only fragments, only witnesses, only ancient voices speaking through broken parchment, telling us not that Genesis was secretly replaced, but that before the text became standardized in later centuries, it lived in a larger and more complicated manuscript world. And to understand what those tiny scraps can really tell us, we have to slow down even further. We have to look at the material itself, the ink, the parchment, the damage, and the extraordinary detective work required to turn a fragment with 5 surviving letters into evidence from the ancient past. Take one of these fragments in your hand if you could. Not that you should. Modern conservators would probably have a very polite but very firm response to that idea. But imagine it. A thin piece of animal skin, browned by age, dry as a fallen leaf, perhaps curled at the edges. On one side, a few lines of black ink. On the other, nothing at all. Or maybe the reverse side carries faint traces from another column, barely visible after 2,000 years in a cave. This is parchment, or, more precisely, prepared animal skin, usually from sheep, goats, or calves. The terms parchment and leather are sometimes used differently by specialists, depending on how the skin was prepared. But the basic point is simple. These texts were written on the carefully treated skins of animals. Making a scroll was slow work. The skin had to be cleaned, stretched, scraped, dried, and cut into sheets. Those sheets could then be sewn together to make a long writing surface. A scribe ruled lines across it, probably with a pointed tool, creating a guide so the writing would remain orderly. Then came the ink, usually a carbon-based mixture made from soot or charcoal combined with water and a binding agent, perhaps gum arabic. Nothing about this was cheap. A Genesis scroll was not casually produced like a shopping list. It required materials, training, time, and a scribe able to copy long stretches of difficult sacred text without losing his place, skipping a line, repeating a phrase, or making a mistake that another reader might later notice. And yet, once the scroll was hidden in a cave and forgotten, all that labour became vulnerable to insects, damp, dust, heat, human disturbance, and simple bad luck. The parchment survived because the Judean desert is brutally dry. In a wetter climate, much of it would have dissolved back into the earth. But surviving is not the same as surviving intact. The desert saved the scrolls, then time broke them. Now, here is the strange problem. A fragment may contain only a few letters, but those letters can still be enough to identify its place in Genesis. How? Partly through language. Biblical Hebrew has patterns. Some phrases occur again and again. Genealogies follow formulas. Legal passages have their own vocabulary. Names of people and places can be distinctive. A fragment preserving part of a phrase like, "and he called his name," followed by a recognizable name, may sharply narrow the possibilities. A sequence involving specific ages, generations, and descendants may point toward one particular genealogy. A rare combination of words may occur only once in the entire book. It is like finding a torn corner of a sentence that says, "and the ark came to rest." You do not need the whole book to suspect you are somewhere in the flood story. But scholars do not identify fragments by intuition alone. They compare every surviving letter with known copies of Genesis. They look at the spacing. They ask how many letters could have fit in the missing parts of a line. They compare the wording with the later standard Hebrew text, often called the Masoretic text, with the Samaritan Pentateuch, with the ancient Greek translation known as the Septuagint, and with other Qumran manuscripts. Sometimes a single unusual spelling is useful. Sometimes the fragment preserves enough of 2 or 3 lines that the identification becomes almost certain. And sometimes the honest answer is much less satisfying. Maybe, possibly Genesis, possibly another biblical text using similar language, possibly too damaged to say that caution matters because ancient fragments can create a dangerous temptation. You want them to speak more clearly than they do. You want 5 letters to reveal a forgotten chapter. You want a gap in the parchment to contain a secret. But a gap is not a secret. Most of the time, it is just missing text. Scholars have a word for a missing section of manuscript, a lacuna. It sounds dramatic, like the name of a desert goddess. But it simply means an absence, a hole, a place where we do not know what was written because the material is gone. And that is one of the central disciplines of Dead Sea Scrolls research, knowing the difference between restoration and invention. Suppose a fragment preserves the beginning and end of a line, while the middle has broken away. If the surviving words match a known verse in Genesis, a scholar may propose the missing words in brackets. Not because those words are physically present, but because they fit the space and are supported by another textual witness. That can be a reasonable reconstruction, but it remains a reconstruction. If the fragment contains wording that differs from later Genesis, the situation becomes more interesting. Was it a scribal slip, an alternative spelling, a different textual tradition, a correction made by a later hand? There is no automatic answer. Each possibility has to be tested against the ink, the handwriting, the available space, the parallel manuscripts, and the history of the text itself. Even the age of the fragment has to be assembled from several kinds of evidence. One method is paleography. That means studying ancient handwriting. Hebrew letters changed gradually over time, not all at once, but in recognizable ways. The shape of an aleph, the curve of a he, the length of a descending stroke, the spacing between words, the overall rhythm of the hand. A trained specialist can compare these features with other dated manuscripts and estimate when a scribe was likely writing. It is not magic. A handwriting style does not come with a date stamped in the corner. Different scribes could write conservatively, older styles could continue. Dates are usually ranges, not precise years, but paleography can often place a manuscript broadly within the centuries before the destruction of the Second Temple in 70 CE. Then there is radiocarbon dating. Carbon dating does not date the moment a scribe dipped his pen into ink. It dates the animal's skin itself, the moment the animal stopped living. That means it provides a range rather than a perfect answer. The parchment could have been stored for some time before it was written on. Testing also requires taking a tiny sample, which is not a decision conservators make lightly. Still, when carbon dating, handwriting analysis, and archaeological context point in roughly the same direction, the case becomes much stronger. The context matters too. Which cave held the fragment? What other manuscripts were found nearby? What kinds of jars, textiles, pottery and settlement remains belong to the period? Cave 4 gives us a huge and chaotic deposit, so it cannot always tell us exactly when one individual manuscript was placed there. But it anchors the collection in the world of late Second Temple Judaism, not in some vague legendary ancient past. And this is why even a damaged Genesis fragment can matter so much. It may preserve only part of one verse, but if that verse shows a spelling, a word order, or a reading different from the later standard Hebrew text, it becomes evidence that more than one form of Genesis circulated in antiquity. One scrap can show that a reading once existed centuries earlier than anyone expected. One line can connect a Qumran manuscript to the Samaritan tradition, or to a reading reflected in Greek translation. One broken edge can remind us that the biblical text was copied by human hands, transmitted through real communities, and still moving toward the more standardized forms that came later. The fragments are incomplete, their silences are real. But their surviving words are not small just because the parchment is small. Sometimes history turns on a single letter that refused to disappear. So, after all that, what do the Qumran copies of Genesis actually say? Are they a completely different Genesis? Did the people who hid these scrolls preserve a version of the book full of missing stories, unfamiliar characters, and secret chapters later removed from the Bible? Usually no, and that answer is important, because the truth is more interesting than the fantasy. Where the Qumran Genesis manuscripts can be compared with the later Masoretic text, the traditional Hebrew form preserved by Jewish scribes, centuries later, there is often broad agreement. The same creation stories, the same flood, the same long family lines descending from Adam, Noah, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. The same strange moments that readers have puzzled over for thousands of years. A garden, a serpent, a brother killing a brother, an ark full of animals, a tower rising toward heaven, a promise made to an elderly man under the stars. The basic story is recognizably Genesis. That may sound less dramatic than discovering an entirely lost Bible, but think about what it means. Some of these fragments were copied around 1,000 years before the oldest complete manuscripts of the Masoretic tradition. They come from a time when the text had not yet been standardized in the way later Jewish communities would standardize it, and yet much of the wording already stands remarkably close to the form familiar in later Hebrew Bibles. That is not proof that every letter was identical. It was not, but it does show that the Genesis later preserved in the Masoretic text did not suddenly appear in the Middle Ages, fully formed and untouched by history. Its roots go much deeper into the manuscript world of Second Temple Judaism. Still, broad agreement is not the same thing as perfect agreement. Imagine 10 people copying the same long letter by hand, not typing it, not using copy and paste, copying it with ink, line after line over several days. One writer uses an older spelling, another adds a letter to make a vowel clearer. A third leaves out a small connecting word because his eye jumped from one similar phrase to another. Someone else changes the order of 2 words without changing the meaning at all. Afterward, the letter is still the same letter, but it is no longer exactly the same in every copy. That is the world of the Qumran Genesis scrolls. Some differences are simply matters of spelling. Ancient Hebrew was often written with fewer vowel letters than later Hebrew. Over time, scribes increasingly used certain consonants to help readers recognize vowel sounds. A word could be written in a shorter form in one manuscript and a fuller form in another, rather like writing colour and colour. The difference may tell us something about scribal habits, pronunciation, or the period of copying, but it does not create a new event in the story. Sometimes the script itself looks different because script changed. The Hebrew letters in the scrolls are not always shaped exactly like the square Hebrew letters seen in a modern printed Bible. Most Qumran manuscripts use an early form of the familiar Jewish script, though some texts preserve the older Paleo-Hebrew style for particular words or names. That can look dramatic to modern eyes, but a different handwriting is not automatically a different text. It is the difference between reading a sentence in block letters, cursive, or the handwriting of someone who had too much coffee and was late for work. Then there are variants in grammar and phrasing. A Qumran manuscript may use one grammatical form where the Masoretic text uses another. It may include or omit a tiny word, and the to, in, with scholars call some of these particles. They are small words that help hold a sentence together. Ancient scribes could add them, omit them, or replace them with equivalents without necessarily changing the basic sense. Names can vary too. A name may be spelled with an extra letter, a slightly different ending, or an alternate form known elsewhere in the biblical world. Genealogies with their repeated formulas and unfamiliar names were especially vulnerable to small copying differences. If you have ever tried to read a list of names aloud and suddenly realized you have no idea whether a person is called Mahalalel, Mahalalel, or something that sounds like a spell from a fantasy novel, you understand the problem. But here is the crucial point. A small textual difference does not automatically mean a different story. If one manuscript says, "and he went," while another says, "then he went," nobody has discovered a new Abraham. If a name has one extra letter, the character has not been replaced by a secret twin. If a scribe writes a fuller spelling, the flood does not happen differently. Most variants are the ordinary traces of texts being copied, read, spoken, and passed from one community to another. The question is not simply, is there a difference? Of course there are differences. The real question is, what kind of difference is this? Scholars begin with the physical manuscript. Is the letter actually visible, or is it partly damaged? Could a dark mark be ink, a fold, a stain, or wishful thinking? Does the proposed reading fit the available space? Is there evidence that a scribe corrected the text above the line or between words? Then they compare witnesses. Does the same reading appear in another Qumran manuscript? Does it resemble the Samaritan Pentateuch? Is it reflected in the ancient Greek translation, the Septuagint? Does it make better sense in context than the Masoretic wording, or does it look like the kind of mistake a tired copyist might make? Some mistakes have recognizable patterns. A scribe's eye can skip from one word to a later word that looks similar, accidentally leaving out everything in between. Or the eye can jump backward, causing a phrase to be copied twice. A scribe may unconsciously replace an unusual word with a more familiar one. These are not mysterious conspiracies. They are human errors. the ancient equivalent of sending a message that says, "Meet me at the library at the library." Other variants may preserve genuine alternative traditions. In some cases, a Qumran reading suggests that more than one Hebrew form of a passage circulated before one form became dominant. That does not mean every version was equally old, equally widespread, or equally authoritative to every community. It means the textual landscape was more diverse than later readers sometimes imagine. And sometimes scholars cannot decide. The fragment is too small. The ink is too faded. The letters can be read more than one way. The difference might be meaningful, accidental, or only apparent because the parchment has broken exactly where the evidence is needed. That uncertainty is not a failure. It is the honest boundary of what these manuscripts can tell us. The Qumran copies of Genesis do not usually reveal a book from another universe. What they reveal is something quieter, and in its own way more astonishing. Genesis was already ancient, already treasured, already copied with extraordinary care. But it was still alive in the hands of scribes, still carrying minor variations, still moving through a world where no single copy had yet silenced all the others. And among those other forms of the text was one tradition that would become especially important, not hidden in a desert cave, but preserved by another community, with its own sacred mountain, its own priesthood, and its own version of the first 5 books of Moses. That community was the Samaritans. Today, the Samaritan community is small. But in antiquity, Samaritan identity was bound up with an enormous claim. They believed they preserved the true Torah, the true priestly tradition, and the true holy place chosen by God. Not Jerusalem with its temple high above the city. Mount Gerizim overlooking the ancient city of Shechem. And they had their own copy of the 5 books of Moses. It is called the Samaritan Pentateuch. Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, written in a form of ancient Hebrew script that looks very different from the Hebrew letters most readers recognize today. To someone opening it for the first time, it can feel like encountering a parallel Bible. Familiar stories, familiar names, familiar laws, Adam and Eve. Noah and the flood. Abraham leaving his homeland. Moses leading Israel through the wilderness. But also thousands of differences. Most are small. Spellings, grammar, tiny connecting words. The kinds of changes that build up naturally when a text is copied and recited for centuries. Some make the wording smoother, some make a difficult sentence easier to follow, and some make one passage agree more closely with another passage somewhere else in the Torah. This is where the Dead Sea Scrolls become especially interesting. Among the manuscripts from Qumran, scholars found copies of Pentateuchal books that sometimes resemble the textual family behind the Samaritan Pentateuch. Not necessarily Samaritan manuscripts in the full religious sense. That distinction matters. These scrolls were not found with a label saying, "Property of the Samaritans, please return to Mount Gerizim." Ancient manuscripts are rarely that considerate. Instead, scholars notice patterns. Certain copies use fuller spellings. Certain copies contain expansions that make one version of an event line up more neatly with another. Certain copies preserve readings that later appear in the Samaritan Pentateuch. So scholars began using a slightly awkward but useful term, pre-Samaritan. Pre-Samaritan does not mean written by Samaritans. It means a manuscript appears to belong to an older textual stream, one that shares some of the same habits later found in the Samaritan Pentateuch. Think of it like discovering an old family recipe. It has many features of the version your grandmother made, but it does not yet include the handwritten note at the bottom saying, "Never trust anyone who puts raisins in it." The shared family resemblance is there, but the later identity has not fully appeared. And what was one of the strongest family traits? Harmonization. That sounds technical, but the idea is simple. The Torah often tells related events in more than one place. A command may be given in one chapter and carried out in another. A journey may be announced, then described later. A law may appear in one form in Exodus and be repeated in Deuteronomy. Sometimes the wording is almost identical, sometimes it is not. A harmonizing scribe makes those passages match more closely. If God gives Moses a detailed instruction, and then Moses carries it out, a harmonizing text may make the report of the action repeat more of the original command. If one passage mentions an important detail and a parallel passage seems to leave it out, the detail may be added. It is not necessarily an attempt to deceive anyone. It can be an attempt to make the text clearer, more complete, more internally consistent. Basically, ancient editors also hated continuity errors. In Genesis, one famous example comes from the story of Cain and Abel. In the Masoretic text, Genesis says that Cain spoke to Abel his brother. Then, when they were in the field, Cain killed him. But what did Cain say? The sentence seems to be missing its actual speech. The Samaritan Pentateuch supplies the words, "Let us go out into the field." That reading is also known from several ancient versions. It may preserve wording that dropped out of another line of transmission, or it may represent an ancient attempt to complete a sentence that seemed unfinished. Scholars debate the precise history, but either way, it shows the kind of textual world we are dealing with. Not one frozen wording, perfectly identical everywhere, but related copies responding to difficult passages in slightly different ways. The Qumran evidence shows that such textual habits existed long before the Samaritan Pentateuch reached the form in which it later survived. That does not mean Qumran gives us a secret Samaritan Genesis hidden in the caves, and it does not mean every reading shared by a Qumran manuscript and the Samaritan Pentateuch must go back to one single lost master copy. Texts can influence each other. Scribal habits can arise independently. Fragments can be too damaged to settle the question. But it does mean the Samaritan text was not simply a late invention dropped into history from nowhere. It had roots in a broader ancient manuscript culture. There is another important distinction. The Samaritan Pentateuch contains readings connected to specifically Samaritan religious claims, especially the holiness of Mount Gerizim. Those readings reflect the community that preserved the text, its worship, its priesthood, and its long rivalry with Jerusalem. But the pre-Samaritan manuscripts from Qumran do not simply carry that later Samaritan identity backward in time. They may share fuller wording, harmonizing expansions, and particular textual choices. Yet they do not automatically preserve the distinctive theology of the later Samaritan community. A shared textual feature is not the same thing as shared religious allegiance. This is the part people often miss. The Dead Sea Scrolls do not replace the traditional Hebrew Genesis with a Samaritan Genesis. They do something more complicated. They show that, before later communities settled around their preferred forms of the text, several streams were flowing at once. One stream stood close to the text, later preserved by Jewish scribes. Another had features later associated with the Samaritan Pentateuch, and still others would appear when Genesis crossed into Greek-speaking lands beyond Judea. The caves did not contain one forbidden replacement Bible. They contained evidence of a crowded, living textual world. And then there was Greek. By the time many of these manuscripts were being copied, Judea was not an isolated corner of the world. It was part of the Eastern Mediterranean, connected by trade routes, armies, ports, taxes, migration, and the enormous cultural reach of Greek language. After the conquests of Alexander the Great, Greek became the common language of government, commerce, education, and public life across much of the region. You could grow up speaking Aramaic at home, read Hebrew in the synagogue, bargain in Greek at the market, and hear Egyptian, Persian, or Latin from travellers passing through town. The world around Genesis was multilingual, and for Jews living far from Judea, especially in cities where Greek was the everyday language, a Hebrew scripture was not always enough. It could still be sacred, it could still be read aloud, but it needed to be understood. So, at some point in the 3rd century before the Common Era, Jewish translators began rendering the Torah into Greek. That Greek collection came to be called the Septuagint. The name means 70, and it comes from a later story that says 72 Jewish elders translated the Torah in Alexandria, Egypt. According to the legend, they worked separately, then emerged with exactly the same translation. A miracle of scholarly agreement so dramatic that anyone who has ever watched 3 people argue about where to order dinner may reasonably pause for a moment. The story is probably more symbolic than historical, but the translation itself is very real. The Greek Genesis in the Septuagint tells the same great story: creation and the garden, Cain and Abel, the flood, Babel, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph, and the journey into Egypt. Yet when scholars place its Greek wording beside the later standard Hebrew text, known as the Masoretic text, they find differences. Some are small. A Greek translator has to make choices that Hebrew never required. Hebrew verbs can be compact and flexible. Greek verbs often demand more precision about time, manner, and relationship. A word with a broad range of meaning in Hebrew may need one specific Greek equivalent. A sentence that sounds mysterious in Hebrew may be made smoother in Greek. A phrase that could be understood 2 ways may be translated in only one. That is not necessarily corruption. It is what translation does. Every translation is also an interpretation. Take a simple word like seed. In Genesis, it can mean literal seed for planting. It can mean descendants. It can point toward a future line of people not yet born. The Greek translator has to decide, line by line, which sense seems most likely. And once that decision enters the text, generations of Greek-speaking readers inherit not just Hebrew words in another language, but a particular understanding of those words. Sometimes the Greek version seems to explain the Hebrew. Sometimes it preserves an ambiguity. Sometimes it appears to make the passage more elegant, more readable, or more suitable for public reading in a Greek-speaking community. But some differences are harder to explain as translation alone. This is where the question becomes interesting. The translators did not necessarily have a Hebrew manuscript identical to the Masoretic text. They may in some passages have worked from Hebrew copies with different wording. Scholars call that underlying Hebrew source a vorlage, which is just a German word meaning the text lying in front of you. Imagine 2 scribes copying Genesis from 2 slightly different Hebrew manuscripts. One manuscript says 70, another says 75. One has a short phrase, another has a fuller line. If one text is later translated into Greek, the Greek difference may not come from the translator at all. It may come from the Hebrew manuscript on the table. And that possibility changes the whole conversation. For centuries, readers could compare the Greek Septuagint with the Masoretic Hebrew and ask which one changed. Did the Greek translator misunderstand? Did later Hebrew scribes preserve a shorter form? Did somebody add an explanation? Did somebody accidentally lose a line? Before the Dead Sea Scrolls, those questions often had to remain frustratingly open. Then the caves gave scholars something they had almost never possessed before: Hebrew manuscripts from centuries before the medieval copies on which the Masoretic text is based. Not complete answers. The Qumran Genesis manuscripts are often fragmentary, and many passages survive in only tiny pieces. A missing reading cannot settle a debate. A few letters cannot always tell us what a whole sentence once said. The desert, unfortunately, was not interested in making future textual critics comfortable. But the scrolls did show that more than one Hebrew textual form existed in the centuries before and around the time of Jesus. Some Qumran manuscripts stand close to the text later preserved in the Masoretic tradition. Others share features with the textual stream behind the Samaritan Pentateuch. And in some biblical books, Qumran manuscripts have readings that come closer to the Greek Septuagint than to the later standard Hebrew text. The strongest examples often come from books other than Genesis, especially Samuel and Jeremiah. There the evidence can be dramatic. Greek passages once dismissed as loose translations sometimes appear to reflect older Hebrew forms that survived in the caves. For Genesis, the picture is quieter and more limited. The surviving fragments do not reveal one complete Septuagint Hebrew Genesis tucked away at Qumran. They do not prove that the Greek Genesis is always older than the Masoretic Hebrew. They do not even prove that every major Greek difference comes from a different Hebrew source. But they make the possibility impossible to ignore. The Greek translators were not automatically inventing every difference. Sometimes they may have been translating a Hebrew text that no longer survives in full. Sometimes they were interpreting. Sometimes they may have misunderstood an unusual word, or chosen a Greek phrase that shifted the meaning slightly. And sometimes later Greek copyists may have altered the Greek itself, just as Hebrew copyists worked within their own manuscript traditions. The Septuagint, then, is not simply Hebrew Genesis wearing Greek clothes. It is a witness to how Jewish communities read Scripture outside Judea, a witness to the Hebrew manuscripts available to translators, a witness to the meanings they heard in ancient, difficult words, and a witness to the fact that Genesis was already travelling far beyond the land where its stories were set. From Jerusalem to Alexandria, from villages in Judea to crowded streets beside the Nile, Genesis entered new languages and new imaginations. And when a sacred text enters a new language, something remarkable happens. Its words are preserved, but its possibilities begin to multiply. But there was another kind of Genesis waiting in the caves. Not a copy of the biblical book, not a Hebrew manuscript with a few different spellings, not a Greek translation carrying the memory of another Hebrew source. Something stranger in Cave 1. Among the first scrolls brought to light after the shepherd's discovery, scholars found a long, badly damaged Aramaic manuscript now known as the Genesis Apocryphon. The name can sound more mysterious than it needs to. Apocryphon simply means a hidden or secret writing. But in this case, it does not mean someone had uncovered the original Genesis that priests, rabbis, or later editors had locked away. It means the scroll was not part of the biblical book of Genesis, as it became known in Jewish and Christian canon. It was a separate work, a retelling, a creative expansion. A familiar, sacred story told again in a different voice. And it was in rough shape. The manuscript had spent nearly 2,000 years rolled up in a cave near the Dead Sea. When it was opened, parts of it were darkened, brittle, stuck together, and missing altogether. Whole sections had decayed. Some columns could be read only with difficulty. Others survived as broken trails of letters, enough to suggest a sentence perhaps, but not always enough to restore it with confidence. Imagine trying to reconstruct a novel after it has been soaked, burned around the edges, folded shut for 20 centuries, and then handed to you in a language written without modern punctuation. That was the Genesis Apocryphon. Scholars pieced it together slowly. They studied the surviving Aramaic letters. They compared its stories with Genesis, with other Jewish writings, and with traditions preserved much later. They examined the order of the columns, the physical joins in the parchment, even the way lines vanished into damaged areas. The result is not a perfect recovery. There are gaps we cannot fill. There are passages whose meaning remains uncertain. But enough survives to show what kind of book this was. It begins in the world before the flood. In biblical Genesis, Lamech becomes the father of Noah, and that is almost all we are told about the birth itself. The Genesis Apocryphon slows down. It lingers. It lets Lamech speak in the first person, worried and confused by the extraordinary appearance of his newborn son. Noah in this retelling seems so unusual that Lamech fears something impossible has happened. He wonders whether the child might be connected not only to his own family, but to the mysterious heavenly beings known from other ancient Jewish traditions. He goes to his father, Methuselah. Methuselah consults the ancient patriarch Enoch, and Enoch gives the answer. The child is truly Lamech's. But he is no ordinary child. Already you can see why this manuscript became fuel for dramatic claims. A scroll from the Dead Sea describing Noah's startling birth. A worried father, Enoch giving secret knowledge. Hints of angels, giants, and a world before the flood that feels much more dangerous than the brief biblical account. It sounds like hidden Genesis, but it is more accurate to call it expanded Genesis. The author was not quietly changing a biblical manuscript one line at a time. The author was taking the ancient story as a foundation and building outward, asking questions that Genesis leaves unanswered. What did Lamech think when Noah was born? What did Noah know about the flood before it came? What did the patriarchs see, fear, dream, and say when no biblical narrator was watching? Then Noah himself takes over. The Genesis Apocryphon gives him a voice. He speaks about the corruption of the earth, the coming destruction, the flood, and the world that emerges afterward. Details are enlarged. Geography becomes more vivid. The story pauses over events that Genesis moves through quickly. This was a common way ancient readers engaged with Scripture. A sacred story was not always treated as a sealed container, where every unanswered question had to remain unanswered forever. It could be interpreted, retold, paraphrased, rearranged, and expanded for new audiences. The authority of Genesis did not prevent later writers from imagining the inner lives of its characters. In many cases, Genesis invited it. Its narratives are famously compact. A few lines can cover years. A brief statement can hide a family crisis, a journey, a dream, or a terror that later readers wanted to explore. The surviving Apocryphon eventually moves from Noah's world to Abram's. And here again, the story becomes intensely personal. Abram speaks in the first person. Sarai appears not merely as a name carried through the plot, but as a figure whose beauty, danger, and vulnerability shape the action. The journey into Egypt receives a fuller treatment. Abram fears that Egyptian rulers will desire Sarai and kill him in order to take her. In Genesis, the couple agrees to say that she is his sister. In the Apocryphon, the episode is expanded with dreams, warnings, royal illness, negotiations, and a much more elaborate account of how Sarai is eventually returned. The biblical story is still recognizable, but it has become a larger world. A world where patriarchs explain themselves, where divine messages arrive through dreams, where kings suffer because they have unknowingly crossed a boundary set by God, where the gaps between one verse and the next are filled with conversation, anxiety, travel, and consequence. And that is precisely why the Genesis Apocryphon matters. It shows that the people who copied and preserved biblical texts also lived among many other texts about biblical figures. Genesis was not alone in the ancient Jewish imagination. Around it grew interpretations, prayers, legal discussions, visions, rewritten histories, and adventurous retellings. Some of these works were treated with great respect. Some were read in particular communities. Some may have been used for teaching. Some eventually fell out of regular use and survived only in fragments, translations, or quotations. But none of that means the canonical book of Genesis had been secretly replaced. The Genesis Apocryphon does not reveal a suppressed master copy. It does not prove that the Genesis now read in Bibles was invented later to hide angels, giants, or strange stories about Noah. Its relationship to Genesis is visible on the page. It depends on the older story. It assumes listeners know it. And then it gives them more dialogue, more explanation, more wonder. In other words, the scroll does not show us a forbidden Genesis. It shows us something perhaps more historically interesting. It shows us Genesis still alive, still being read closely enough that people wanted to enter its silences, still powerful enough that later writers could tell its stories again, not because the old version had failed, but because its mysteries had not stopped working on them. And the Genesis Apocryphon was only one example. Another ancient work would go even further, taking the whole sweep of Genesis and Exodus, measuring it out according to a heavenly calendar, and retelling history as though time itself had been carefully organized from above. And this is where the story becomes especially strange, because the Genesis Apocryphon does not simply tell us that Lamech had a son named Noah. It gives us a frightened father standing over a newborn child and wondering whether that child is really his. Picture the scene. Lamech sees Noah for the first time, and according to the surviving Aramaic text, the baby does not look ordinary. His body is described in startling terms. His appearance is bright. His hair is unusually white. His eyes seem to shine. Some related traditions say that when the child opened his eyes, the whole house became bright. Then, almost immediately, the infant does something even more alarming. He speaks. Now, the manuscript is damaged, and scholars have to be careful about exactly how every line should be restored. But the basic shape of the story is clear enough. Noah appears so extraordinary that Lamech panics. He wonders whether his wife has conceived the child through one of the heavenly beings associated with the dangerous world before the flood. It is a family crisis on a cosmic scale. Lamech does not accuse his wife in a casual domestic sense. He is afraid of something much bigger. In the ancient Jewish imagination, heaven and earth were not always safely separated. There were angels. There were rebellious watchers. There were heavenly secrets passed down to human beings. And there were giants, enormous figures connected with an age of violence and corruption before the flood. So Lamech goes to Methuselah, his father. Methuselah, in turn, seeks out Enoch. That detail matters. Enoch is one of the most mysterious figures in Genesis. In the biblical text, his story is remarkably short. He lives 365 years, walks with God, and then he is gone, because God takes him. That is all Genesis says. But later Jewish writers looked at those few lines and saw an opening. What if Enoch had been taken into heaven? What if he had learned the secrets of the angels? What if he had become the one person capable of explaining what was happening in the strange world before the flood? That is exactly the role he plays here. Enoch receives the question from Methuselah and sends back an answer. Noah is truly Lamech's son. His unusual appearance does not mean he belongs to the rebellious heavenly beings, but it does mean that he has a special role in the story that is coming. He will survive when the world does not, and he will become the beginning of humanity after the flood. It is an extraordinary expansion of a biblical silence. Genesis gives Noah's genealogy in a few lines. Lamech lives 182 years, fathers Noah, and gives him a name connected with comfort or relief. Then the story moves on. The Genesis Apocryphon asks what that birth might have felt like from inside the family. What would it mean to bring a child into a world already haunted by violence, strange beings, and rumours of heavenly corruption? What would it mean if that child looked less like a normal infant and more like a sign? And this is where the Apocryphon joins a much larger network of Second Temple Jewish writings. Genesis 6 contains one of the Bible's most famous mysteries. It says that the sons of God saw that human women were beautiful and took wives for themselves. Then it mentions the Nephilim, figures often associated in later tradition with giants. But Genesis does not stop to explain who the sons of God were, what exactly happened, or how the Nephilim fit into the coming flood. It gives readers a few dark lines, then moves forward. Other ancient writings did not move forward so quickly. The Book of Watchers, now part of 1 Enoch, tells a much fuller story. In that version, heavenly watchers descend to earth, take human wives and produce giant offspring. The Watchers also teach forbidden knowledge, weapon-making, magical arts, astronomy, cosmetics, and other skills that can become dangerous in a violent world. The result is catastrophe. The giants consume the earth's resources. Violence spreads. Human beings cry out. And the flood becomes not just a punishment for vague wickedness, but a cleansing of a world thrown out of order by rebellion from above. The Dead Sea Scrolls preserve copies of Enochic writings, along with fragments of another work, often called the Book of Giants. So the people associated with Qumran were living among traditions in which Noah's birth was not a minor family detail. It was part of the great crisis before the flood. A child born with an uncanny brightness could raise a terrifying question. Was he connected to the corruption, or was he the answer to it? The Genesis Apocryphon chooses the second possibility. Noah is not a giant. He is not the child of an angel. He is Lamech's son, but his strange appearance signals that he belongs to the divine plan in a world that is about to collapse. Later readers could find this fascinating for obvious reasons. It gives Noah a dramatic origin story. It turns a familiar patriarch into a child of wonder. It gives Enoch access to hidden knowledge, and it fills Genesis 6 with names, motives, rebels, monsters, and cosmic stakes. But it could also be unsettling. The story comes close to a boundary many readers prefer to keep firm, the boundary between angels and humans, heaven and earth, ordinary family life and supernatural intrusion. It imagines a universe crowded with beings whose actions can alter human history. It suggests that dangerous knowledge can descend from above, and it makes even Noah's paternity briefly uncertain. That is powerful material, but it is not direct manuscript evidence that Genesis itself once contained this entire story. The distinction is important. The Genesis Apocryphon is not a damaged copy of Genesis 6 with the missing angel and giant details restored. It is a separate literary work written in Aramaic, drawing on Genesis and on wider traditions circulating in ancient Judaism. It tells us how some readers expanded the biblical story. It does not prove that every expansion stood in the earlier biblical text. Still, the expansion reveals something real. Genesis was never read in a vacuum. Its brief, unsettling references to sons of God, Nephilim, and the flood invited interpretation. And ancient writers answered its silences with a world of watchers, giants, heavenly journeys, and a newborn Noah, whose first appearance seemed to make the whole house shine. But the ancient readers who expanded Genesis did not only add strange births, watchers and giants. Some of them reorganized time itself. Imagine opening Genesis and discovering that every event, from creation to the flood, from Abraham's journeys to the descent into Egypt, has been placed inside an enormous sacred calendar. Nothing happens vaguely. Nothing simply occurs. After many days, every birth, covenant, journey, and disaster belongs to a numbered sequence of weeks and jubilees, as if history has been measured out in heaven long before human beings ever lived it. That is the world of the Book of Jubilees. Jubilees is one of the most important Jewish writings from the Second Temple period. It retells much of Genesis and the beginning of Exodus, carrying the story from creation through the patriarchs and toward Moses receiving the law at Sinai. But it is not merely a summary. It is a rewritten version of sacred history, one with its own emphases, explanations, and rules. In the story, Moses is on Mount Sinai. An angel speaks to him and reveals the true history of the world. Moses is told to write what he hears, so Jubilees presents itself as hidden knowledge made available at the mountain, a fuller account of the past that explains how the world was supposed to work. And the title comes from its system of time. A Jubilee is a period of 49 years made up of 7 weeks of years. Each week contains 7 years. 7 weeks make 49. Then history continues into the next Jubilee, and the next, like an immense pattern repeating across the centuries. It can sound complicated at first, but that is exactly the point. Jubilees wants history to feel ordered. Adam does not simply live and die somewhere in the distant past. Noah does not build the ark at an uncertain moment. Abraham does not wander through Canaan in a vague ancestral age. Their lives are carefully placed within a framework of numbered years, weeks, and jubilees. Sacred history becomes a kind of cosmic ledger. This is not modern chronology. It is not an attempt to give historians a neutral calendar they can match neatly against archaeological dates. It is theological time, time arranged to show that God's plan has structure, rhythm, and purpose. The same pattern appears in the calendar Jubilees promotes. The book strongly favours a solar year of 364 days, 52 complete weeks. That number matters because it makes every festival fall on the same day of the week each year. No drifting, no confusion, no sacred day arriving at the wrong time, because the calendar has slipped out of place. For the author of Jubilees, correct timekeeping was not a minor administrative problem. It was part of obedience. If the calendar was wrong, festivals could be observed on the wrong days. And if sacred festivals were observed at the wrong time, then the order established by God was being disturbed. What looks to us like a disagreement about counting days could become a disagreement about the structure of reality. And just briefly, if you enjoy these old mysteries where a few surviving lines open into an entire lost world, the channel's book about 12 unexplained mysteries is available through the website. The link is in the description. Jubilees also does something even more striking. It finds laws in Genesis long before Moses receives the law. In the biblical version of Genesis, Abraham builds altars, makes covenants, travels, fathers children, and trusts God. But he lives centuries before Sinai. The detailed laws associated with Moses have not yet been formally given to Israel. Jubilees sees things differently. Its patriarchs often behave as if they already know the later commandments. Noah understands rules about blood and sacrifice. Abraham keeps festivals. Jacob observes practices that later become part of Israel's sacred law. The law is not presented as a new invention, suddenly introduced at Sinai. It is ancient. It is woven into creation. The great ancestors already knew it, or at least knew enough to live in harmony with it. That changes the meaning of Genesis. The stories are no longer only about origins. They become examples. Abraham is not just the ancestor of a people. He is a model of correct conduct. Noah is not only the survivor of the flood. He is someone who keeps divine instructions in a world that has forgotten them. And above all of this stands heaven. Jubilees is filled with angels. Angels deliver revelation. Angels record events. Angels are connected with the heavenly tablets, a kind of celestial archive in which the true order of history and law already exists. Human beings are not making up sacred time as they go along. They are meant to align themselves with a pattern already written above. It is a powerful idea, Your life may feel uncertain. Empires rise and fall. Families make choices that lead to blessing or disaster. But somewhere beyond the confusion, history has a shape. The calendar has a shape. The law has a shape. Even the past, properly understood, has a shape. For a community living under foreign rule, surrounded by competing Jewish groups and competing interpretations of Scripture, that could be deeply comforting. It could also be deeply demanding, because if the heavenly order is exact, then compromise becomes dangerous. A wrong calendar is not just different, it risks becoming rebellion. A law ignored is not merely an old custom neglected. It is a break with the way the universe was arranged from the beginning. And the Dead Sea Scrolls show that Jubilees was not some isolated book lost at the margins. Fragments of Jubilees were found among the scrolls preserved in Hebrew. That matters because for centuries the complete text was known mainly through later translations, especially an Ethiopic version. The Qumran fragments confirmed that Jubilees circulated in Hebrew in ancient Jewish circles and that it belonged to the literary world of the scrolls. The surviving fragments are incomplete, as so often happens in this desert library, but their presence is significant. Copies of Jubilees appear to have been valued, copied and preserved alongside biblical books, Enochic writings, legal texts, prayers and community rules. That does not mean every group of Jews accepted Jubilees in exactly the same way. Ancient Judaism was not a single uniform world with one approved reading list. But it does show that some readers treated this rewritten Genesis as serious, meaningful sacred literature. And it reveals something important about how Genesis could be read. For these readers, Genesis was not safely sealed in the past. It spoke directly to arguments about festivals, purity, marriage, sacrifice, identity, and obedience. The lives of Adam, Noah, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob were not distant family memories. They were instructions, they were warnings, they were evidence that the laws and calendar a community followed in the present had roots in the very beginning of the world. So when we read Jubilees, we are not discovering a secret replacement for Genesis. We are discovering an ancient argument about Genesis. An argument that said the first book of the Bible contained more than a story of beginnings. It contained a hidden order of time, a law older than Sinai, and a heavenly pattern that faithful people were expected to follow on earth. But the argument went even deeper than festivals. If the law had roots in creation, then creation itself had to be understood as an ordered system. Not just the beginning of matter, light, water, land, animals and human beings. Creation was the first establishment of boundaries. Day separated from night, sea separated from dry land, seasons separated from one another. The heavenly lights placed in the sky to govern days, months, years, and appointed times. Genesis says all of this in a few spare, powerful lines. God speaks, light appears, waters are divided, the earth brings forth life, the sun, moon, and stars are set in their places. Then after 6 days God rests. The account is remarkably concise. It does not pause to explain the movement of the stars. It does not name the angels who might govern the heavens. It does not provide a detailed calendar. It does not tell the reader precisely how the months should be counted, or which day of the week every future festival must occupy. Later readers saw room inside that silence. For authors associated with writings like Jubilees, 1 Enoch, and several calendrical texts found among the Dead Sea Scrolls, the creation story was not brief because the details did not matter. It was brief because the details were assumed to exist in heaven. Genesis offered the outline. Other revelation, they believed, could disclose the deeper design. Picture the universe as an enormous temple. The earth below has its seasons, sacrifices, Sabbaths, and festivals. Above it, the heavens move with perfect regularity. The stars do not forget their courses. The sun does not arrive late. The angels do not debate which day a sacred occasion should begin. Everything in heaven follows its assigned order, and human beings in this way of thinking were supposed to do the same. That is why the calendar mattered so much. The solar calendar, favoured in Jubilees, divided the year into 364 days, exactly 52 weeks, 4 seasons of 91 days each. Each season neatly divided again. The structure is almost obsessively balanced. Because 364 divides evenly by 7, dates never drift through the days of the week. A festival that began on a particular weekday would return on that same weekday every year. It is a calendar designed to feel like creation itself, measured, symmetrical, stable. There was, of course, a practical problem. The actual solar year is a little more than 365 days. A calendar of 364 days would eventually fall behind the seasons unless some correction was made. The surviving texts do not leave scholars with one completely clear answer for how every group handled that difficulty. Perhaps adjustments were assumed. Perhaps the number was valued above ordinary astronomical precision. Perhaps different communities used related systems in different ways. But the symbolic force is unmistakable. 52 weeks meant that the year was built from complete Sabbaths. Time itself seemed to be arranged in sacred units. The weekly rhythm was not merely a human custom, it was woven into the fabric of the cosmos. And this put some Jewish groups into conflict with others. By the Second Temple period, Jews did not all use the same calendar. Lunar months, observed from the changing moon, were widely important in the ancient Near East and in Jewish life. But lunar calendars required careful observation and adjustment. Months could begin according to sightings. Festivals could move in relation to the weekday. Authorities had to decide when the new month had begun. To supporters of a fixed solar order that could look dangerously uncertain. If people disagreed about the calendar, they could disagree about Passover. They could celebrate the Day of Atonement on different days. One group might be fasting while another was eating. One group might be gathering for a holy assembly while another considered it an ordinary day. That is not a small disagreement. It is easy to imagine it as an argument between people with competing charts. But for ancient communities, it could become an argument about who was truly obeying God. If heaven kept perfect time, then worship on earth had to match heaven. Otherwise people might be offering the right sacrifice on the wrong day, which in this worldview could mean the sacrifice was not right at all. Several texts found at Qumran preserve lists of priestly courses, the rotating divisions of priests who served in the temple. These lists connect priestly service to an orderly calendar. Week after week, Sabbath after Sabbath, each group takes its appointed turn. Other texts map festivals, seasons, and significant dates onto the same kind of regular structure. The effect is almost calming. History may be chaotic. Political rulers may be corrupt. Armies may cross the land. The temple in Jerusalem may be controlled by priests a group considers illegitimate. But the heavenly schedule remains intact. The true sequence of sacred time has not been lost. It can still be known, preserved, and followed. Angels belong to this same vision of order. In Genesis, angels appear only occasionally. Cherubim guard the way to Eden. Mysterious visitors come to Abraham. Jacob dreams of beings moving between heaven and earth. The biblical narrative leaves much unsaid about their ranks, duties, and worship. The Qumran library contains writings that imagine a far more populated heaven. Angels keep records, angels deliver revelation, angels participate in the praise of God. In the songs of the Sabbath sacrifice, another collection associated with the scrolls, worshippers are invited into an extraordinary vision of the heavenly sanctuary. Priestly angelic beings praise God in ordered ranks. The language can be difficult and fragmentary, but its central impression is clear. Heaven is not empty space. It is a perfectly organized realm of worship. And earthly worship, at least ideally, should echo it. This is one reason Genesis could become so much more than a story about the distant beginning. The separation of light from darkness becomes the beginning of sacred distinctions. The creation of the heavenly lights becomes the foundation for festivals. The seventh day becomes the model for Sabbath. The ordering of the world becomes an argument for ordering human life. But we should be careful here. The Dead Sea Scrolls do not give us a single voice speaking for one completely known community. Qumran certainly preserved texts with strong concerns about priesthood, purity, angels, law, and calendars. Many scholars connect these concerns to a sectarian movement often identified with the Essenes. But not every scroll was necessarily written by that movement. Not every text reflects the same beliefs, and not every Jewish reader who valued a solar calendar lived at Qumran. The caves preserve a library, not a simple membership card. Still, the library reveals a world in which Genesis was alive with implications. Its few verses about sun, moon, seasons, and Sabbath could support an entire vision of cosmic government. A vision where time was sacred, angels served in heaven, and faithful people on earth were called to bring their lives into rhythm with an order established before Adam opened his eyes. And once heaven was imagined as that carefully organized, another question became unavoidable. What happened when beings from heaven crossed the boundary and came down to earth? Genesis 6 gives an answer so brief that it has troubled readers for more than 2,000 years. It says that human beings multiplied on the earth, and daughters were born to them. Then the sons of God saw that the daughters of men were beautiful, and they took wives for themselves. A few lines later, Genesis mentions the Nephilim, mysterious figures who were on the earth in those days, and also afterward described as ancient warriors, men of renown. Then the story moves toward the flood. That is almost all Genesis says. Who were the sons of God? Were they angels, royal rulers, descendants of a particular human line, or something else entirely? Who were the Nephilim? Giants in the physical sense? Violent warriors remembered in legend. The Hebrew word itself is difficult, and ancient readers did not all agree on what it meant. But many Jewish readers of the Second Temple period did not leave those questions unanswered. They built an entire cosmic disaster story around them. Among the texts found in and around the Dead Sea Scrolls are copies of 1 Enoch, including its oldest major section, often called the Book of Watchers. There are also fragments of another extraordinary work, the Book of Giants. These texts do not replace Genesis. They do not claim to be missing pages physically cut out of the biblical book. They are interpretive traditions, expansions, retellings, and reflections built around the small, enigmatic opening Genesis had provided. Genesis gives a few lines. The Book of Watchers opens those lines into a vast and dangerous world. In this story, a group of angels called Watchers descend from heaven. They come down to earth, traditionally onto a mountain, and they take human women as wives. Their union produces giant offspring, beings of overwhelming appetite and destructive power. The details vary across surviving manuscripts and later versions. Some passages are damaged, some are preserved in Ethiopic translations much later than the Qumran fragments. But the basic story is clear enough. Heavenly beings cross a boundary that should not be crossed, and the result is catastrophe. The giants consume the produce of human labour. Then, when that is not enough, they turn against animals and human beings. The earth fills with violence. Bloodshed rises upward. Creation, which Genesis had presented as ordered and divided into proper realms, begins to come apart. It is the reverse of the orderly universe imagined in the calendrical texts. Above, angels keep their stations and worship in ranks. Below, human beings are meant to live within sacred boundaries of time and law. But here, angels abandon their proper dwelling, they descend. They mix heaven and earth in a way these writers considered profoundly wrong. The boundary between realms breaks down, and violence follows. The Watchers do not only bring forbidden offspring into the world, they bring forbidden knowledge. One angel teaches humans the making of weapons. Another reveals metalworking. Others teach spells, enchantments, the cutting of roots, the signs of the heavens, and the secret movements of the stars. In some versions, women learn cosmetics and ornamentation. Human beings gain skills that are not necessarily evil in themselves. Metal can make a tool as easily as a sword. Knowledge of the stars can guide a calendar as easily as fuel divination. But in the Watcher's story, this knowledge arrives in the wrong way from the wrong teachers and produces the wrong results. It becomes knowledge without wisdom, power without restraint. That concern would have made sense in the turbulent world of the Second Temple period. Ancient Judea sat between large empires. Armies moved through the region. Priests, kings, and foreign rulers could all claim authority. For communities who saw history as a struggle between divine order and human corruption, the violence before the flood was not merely ancient history. It was a pattern. The world had been corrupted once before. It could be corrupted again, and so the flood becomes more than a flood. In Genesis, God sees that human wickedness has become great and decides to bring judgment upon the earth. Noah finds favor, an ark is built, waters cover the world. The story is already immense, terrifying and strangely quiet. The Book of Watchers gives that judgment a wider target. The rebellious angels are condemned, the giants are destroyed. The earth, polluted by violence and blood, must be cleansed. The flood is not simply punishment for ordinary human wrongdoing. It is a cosmic response to a cosmic violation. The Watchers are bound and imprisoned until a final judgment. Their giant children die, but some later traditions explain that their restless spirits remain active as evil spirits. This is one way ancient Jewish writers tried to account for a difficult question. If the flood destroyed the corrupt world, why does evil still remain afterward? The Book of Giants takes the story in another direction. Its surviving Qumran fragments are incomplete, like pieces from a shattered mural. But they preserve names of giant figures, frightening dreams, and anxiety about coming destruction. The giants dream of judgment. They seek interpretation. Enoch, the ancient figure who in Genesis simply walked with God, becomes a messenger and interpreter of heavenly revelation. That is a remarkable transformation. Genesis gives Enoch only a few words. He lives 365 years. He walks with God. Then he is gone, because God takes him. Later tradition sees an opening in that silence. If Enoch was taken into God's presence, perhaps he had learned heavenly secrets. Perhaps he could explain dreams sent from above. Perhaps he could warn angels and giants that the world they had helped ruin was moving toward judgment. This is how Genesis grew in the imaginations of ancient readers. Not by becoming unrecognizable, but by becoming a doorway. A few obscure verses about sons of God and Nephilim opened onto angels, giants, secret teachings, heavenly tablets, terrible dreams, imprisoned rebels, and a flood large enough to cleanse a damaged cosmos. And at Qumran, these were not obscure stories at the edge of the library. Copies of Enoch were numerous. The Book of Giants was preserved there too. That does not prove every person connected to the caves believed every detail in exactly the same way. But it does show that these traditions mattered. They gave readers a way to explain why the world had become violent before the flood, why evil seemed so persistent, and why the boundaries set at creation had to be guarded so carefully. Because once heaven itself could rebel, no boundary could be treated as small. And that same world of expanded Genesis would soon turn from giants and angels to another family shaped by mystery, danger, and divine promise. The family of Abraham. The family of Abraham, or in the older forms of the names preserved in Genesis, Abram and Sarai. Their story begins with a journey. A man leaves his homeland, travels through unfamiliar country, receives a promise from God, and becomes the ancestor of nations. But like the brief story of the Watchers, the biblical account leaves room around its edges. It tells us where Abram goes, but often not what the road felt like. It tells us that danger appears, but not always what Abram and Sarai thought in the middle of it. The Genesis Apocryphon enters those spaces. This remarkable Aramaic work, preserved only in damaged columns from Cave 1 at Qumran, retells parts of Genesis in the voice of its major characters. Earlier sections give Noah and Lamech expanded speeches. Later, the scroll turns toward Abram. The surviving text is incomplete, but enough remains to show what its author was doing. This is not simply Genesis copied in another language. It is Genesis remembered, narrated, enlarged, and made intimate. Abram speaks in the first person. He recounts travels through the land, encounters with rulers, movements between places, and the unfolding promise that his descendants will possess the land. The geography matters, place names matter. The patriarch is not floating through a vague sacred landscape. He is moving through a world of valleys, rivers, settlements, cultivated land, political borders, and possible threats. Then comes Egypt. In Genesis 12, famine drives Abram south. He approaches Egypt with Sarai and fears that the Egyptians will kill him in order to take her. So he asks her to say she is his sister. Sarai is taken into Pharaoh's household. Abram receives livestock, servants, and wealth. Then God afflicts Pharaoh's house with great plagues. Pharaoh realizes something has gone wrong, and Abram and Sarai are sent away. It is a compact story, but it can feel uncomfortable. Abram, chosen by God, seems afraid. Sarai becomes vulnerable because of his plan. Pharaoh, though he takes Sarai, appears not to know that she is married. And God's intervention arrives suddenly, with little explanation of how anyone understood the crisis. The Genesis Apocryphon slows everything down. Before the encounter with Pharaoh, Abram has a dream. He sees a cedar tree and a date palm. A man comes and tries to cut down the cedar, but the date palm speaks, warning him not to destroy it. The cedar and the palm are to be spared together. Abram wakes troubled by the dream. Sarai interprets it. The cedar, she explains, represents Abram. The date palm represents her. Someone will seek to separate them, but Abram will be preserved because of her. It is an extraordinary reversal. In the biblical story, Abram tells Sarai what to do. In the Apocryphon, Sarai understands the dream. She sees the danger before it arrives. She becomes not merely the beautiful wife who draws Pharaoh's attention, but an interpreter of divine warning, a partner in survival, and a figure through whom Abram himself will be protected. Then, when they near Egypt, the danger becomes specific. The Egyptian officials see Sarai and praise her beauty. The Apocryphon lingers over it, describing her in lavish terms. To modern readers, that can feel unsettling, and it probably should. The story is still about a woman exposed to the power of a royal court. But the retelling also works to preserve Sarai's honour. Her beauty does not make her passive. Her wisdom has already identified the threat. Her relationship with Abram remains central. And when Pharaoh takes her, the text makes clear that the king does not simply possess what he desires. A divine barrier stands in the way, According to the surviving account, Pharaoh is afflicted, and his household suffers with him. He is unable to approach Sarai. Eventually, Pharaoh seeks an explanation. His court includes figures who investigate the strange calamity, and Abram's identity emerges. The crisis is resolved. Sarai is returned. Abram leaves Egypt not defeated but protected. That reshaping matters. Ancient retellings often tried to resolve tensions that readers felt in inherited stories. How could Abram, the recipient of divine promise, place Sarai in such danger? How could the mother of Israel's future be taken into a foreign king's house? How could the promised family survive the power of Egypt before Israel even existed as a people? The Genesis Apocryphon does not erase the danger. It expands it, then surrounds it with dreams, interpretation, providence, and divine protection. Abram still fears. Sarai is still threatened. Pharaoh still represents the dangerous wealth and authority of a foreign empire. But the story now makes the meaning clearer. God has not abandoned the chosen family. Sarai is not forgotten inside Pharaoh's palace, and the promise attached to Abram cannot be cut down because the date palm stands beside the cedar. This is what an expanded patriarchal world could do. It could honour Abraham without pretending he never faced fear. It could honour Sarah by giving her greater insight, dignity, and agency. It could transform a troubling episode into a demonstration that divine promises survive famine, borders, kings, and human weakness. For ancient readers, then, Genesis was not encountered only as a fixed sequence of copied lines. It was encountered in manuscripts, translations, prayers, interpretations, rewritten histories, and imaginative retellings like the Genesis Apocryphon. The biblical story remained the foundation, but around it grew a living world of explanation. And in that world, the patriarchs did not merely walk through the land. They dreamed there, they feared there, they interpreted signs. They faced empires. And sometimes, in the gaps between a few lines of Genesis, they became more human, more vulnerable, and more extraordinary than the shorter text had ever allowed them to be. But this living world of interpretation would later create a different kind of mystery. Not a mystery inside the ancient stories, a mystery around the scrolls themselves. For decades after their discovery, many people heard that some Dead Sea Scrolls were hidden away, locked from public view, perhaps because they contained dangerous ideas about Genesis, angels, giants, Noah, Abraham, or the origins of Christianity. The phrase "forbidden scrolls" began appearing in popular books, documentaries, and whispered conversations. It had everything a good mystery needs: desert caves, fragmentary ancient manuscripts, powerful religious institutions, scholars with exclusive access, and texts that seemed to tell familiar biblical stories in unfamiliar ways. But the real story is both less dramatic and, in some ways, more interesting. The scrolls were not discovered as neat books waiting to be placed on a shelf. They arrived in pieces. Some manuscripts survived almost intact, especially the famous Great Isaiah Scroll from Cave 1. But most of the material recovered from the caves near Qumran consisted of fragments. Tiny scraps of parchment, bits of papyrus, pieces darkened by age, stained by soil, curled at the edges, or broken into shapes that no longer resembled pages at all. Imagine trying to reconstruct a library after someone had taken thousands of books, torn many of them into confetti, mixed the pieces together, left them in caves for 2,000 years, and then handed them to a small group of scholars with the instruction: work out what belongs where. That was the problem. The first discoveries created enormous excitement. Scrolls from Cave 1 were acquired, studied, and published relatively quickly, though even that process took time. But in 1952, Cave 4 was found, and Cave 4 changed everything. It contained by far the largest collection of manuscripts. Not dozens of complete scrolls, but tens of thousands of fragments from hundreds of ancient works. Biblical books, commentaries, rules for communal life, hymns, calendars, legal texts, Aramaic stories, works like Jubilees and the Genesis Apocryphon, pieces of writings that had never been known before. The scale was overwhelming. Before anyone could publish a text, the fragments had to be conserved. They had to be cleaned carefully, protected from further damage, photographed, identified by material and handwriting, and compared with other pieces. Scholars had to determine whether two fragments came from the same manuscript, the same column, or perhaps entirely different texts written by different scribes generations apart. And ancient handwriting is not always generous to modern readers. Ink fades, letters break off at the edge of a fragment. Hebrew and Aramaic scripts can be difficult to distinguish when only a few strokes survive. A single word may be reconstructed from 3 visible letters, and a great deal of educated caution. Sometimes a scholar could place a fragment with confidence. Sometimes the best answer was simply, "We do not yet know." This work moved slowly. It also became concentrated in the hands of a relatively small international editorial team. Many of the Cave 4 materials were entrusted to scholars working in Jerusalem, under the authority of the Jordanian Department of Antiquities before 1967, and later within a changed political and institutional landscape. The team included experts from different countries and Christian backgrounds, including Catholic clergy. That fact later became fuel for suspicion. Why, people asked, were so few people allowed to see the manuscripts? Why did publication take so long? And why were some texts still unavailable decades after the caves had been opened? Those were fair questions. The answer, however, was not a simple story of a church discovering texts that threatened its beliefs and hiding them from the world. There is no solid evidence that the major unpublished scrolls were withheld because they contained secrets capable of overturning Judaism or Christianity. Much of their content was eventually shown to be exactly what the collection had always suggested: ancient Jewish literature, biblical manuscripts, sectarian writings, prayers, interpretations, legal debates, and imaginative expansions of Scripture. Remarkable material, certainly, but not proof of a hidden alternate Bible suppressed by a single institution. The real problems were more ordinary and more frustrating. Too few specialists, too many fragments, limited funding, slow photographic methods, personal rivalries, editorial delays, disagreements over access and authority. Some scholars held fragments for years while preparing editions that took far longer than anyone expected. In an academic world, control of an unpublished text could mean a career-making discovery. That did not require a grand conspiracy. Human ambition was enough. Still, limited access created a vacuum, and vacuums fill quickly. By the 1980s, criticism had become intense. Scholars outside the original editorial circle argued that material discovered with public resources should not remain effectively private for generations. Journalists and popular writers began describing the unpublished texts as secret or forbidden. Some claims grew more extravagant with repetition. Perhaps the scrolls revealed a Christianity before Jesus. Perhaps they exposed a suppressed Jewish movement. Perhaps religious authorities feared what ordinary readers might learn. But the evidence did not really support those conclusions. What the controversy did reveal was something important about scholarship. Knowledge can be delayed without being deliberately censored. Institutions can be closed, slow, territorial, and unfair without coordinating a hidden plan. And when ancient documents remain inaccessible, people naturally imagine that the missing pieces must be explosive. Then the walls began to come down. In the early 1990s, photographs of many unpublished fragments became available to a wider circle of researchers. the Huntington Library in California announced that it would allow access to its photographic archive. Soon, facsimile editions made images of the cave 4 fragments broadly available. The old editorial monopoly was broken. This did not mean that every fragment suddenly became easy to read. It meant that more eyes could look, more scholars could compare handwriting, more specialists could challenge proposed reconstructions, more editions could be prepared. Over the following years, the enormous series known as Discoveries in the Judean Desert brought the manuscripts into publication volume by volume. Today, translations, photographs, transcriptions, and scholarly discussions of many scrolls can be consulted far more easily than they could during the long years of restricted access. And what emerged was not a single forbidden message. It was a crowded ancient library, a library in which Genesis could be copied carefully, translated into Greek, reshaped in Jubilees, retold in the Genesis Apocryphon, and surrounded by stories of angels, giants, calendars, covenants, and heavenly order. Some texts were treasured by particular communities. Some may have been disputed. Some were not included in later Jewish or Christian biblical canons. But different from later scripture does not automatically mean banned. Unpublished does not automatically mean suppressed. And difficult to interpret does not automatically mean dangerous. The real uncertainty remains, but it is academic uncertainty. Who exactly collected these manuscripts? Were they all written at Qumran, or brought there from elsewhere? How did particular fragments fit together? Which readings are original, and which reflect scribal change? What did the people who preserved these texts believe Genesis meant? Those questions are still open, and perhaps that is why the scrolls continue to feel secret, even after so much has been published. Not because someone successfully hid the truth, but because the desert preserved only pieces of it. And those pieces changed the study of Genesis in a very specific way. Not by replacing the book of Genesis with a secret version, not by revealing that everything later readers believed was invented, and not by handing us one perfect original text, preserved untouched beneath the desert sand. What the Dead Sea Scrolls changed was the scale of the question. Before Qumran, the oldest complete Hebrew manuscripts of Genesis were medieval. The great Masoretic manuscripts, copied by Jewish scribes in the 9th, 10th, and 11th centuries after Christ, were extraordinarily careful works. They preserved the Hebrew text with remarkable precision, but they were still more than 1,000 years later than the period when many biblical books had taken their familiar shape. Then the caves produced copies of Genesis from roughly the 3rd century before Christ through the 1st century after Christ. Suddenly, surviving Hebrew evidence for Genesis had moved back many centuries. That does not mean every question became easy, far from it. Most of the Genesis scrolls are fragmentary, a few verses here, part of a chapter there, sometimes only a handful of words. But even those scraps allowed scholars to compare ancient forms of the text with the medieval manuscripts that had long stood at the centre of biblical study, and one result was genuinely striking. In many places, the Genesis manuscripts from Qumran agree closely with the later Masoretic text. The same stories, the same sequence of generations, the same covenant scenes, the same names, places, and promises. Adam and Eve, Noah and the flood, Abraham leaving his homeland, Jacob wrestling through the night, Joseph descending into Egypt. Across an enormous stretch of time, the basic text had been transmitted with impressive stability. That matters because it shows that ancient scribes were not casually rewriting Genesis every time they copied it. Copying was often a disciplined craft. Words mattered. Lines mattered. The shape of the inherited text mattered. The medieval Hebrew Bible did not suddenly appear from nowhere. It stood within a long history of careful preservation. But that is only half the story. because other Qumran manuscripts do not match the later Masoretic tradition in every detail. Some readings resemble the Samaritan Pentateuch, others appear closer to the ancient Greek translation known as the Septuagint, and some seem to preserve readings found nowhere else among surviving witnesses. Usually these are small differences, a spelling variation, a word added or omitted, a different grammatical form. Sometimes the order or wording of a phrase shifts slightly. But small differences can tell a large story. They suggest that before later Jewish communities increasingly standardized the Hebrew biblical text, Genesis existed in more than one textual form. Not necessarily wildly different books with different plots and different patriarchs, more like a family of closely related manuscripts, copies that shared a common inheritance while carrying the marks of different scribes, different regions, and different textual traditions. Think of it like a river before it enters a narrow channel. For centuries, the waters of Genesis moved through several streams. Hebrew copies, Samaritan copies, Greek translations, manuscripts whose descendants did not survive. Then, over time, some channels became dominant, while others narrowed, merged, or disappeared. The Dead Sea Scrolls let us glimpse that earlier, wider river system, and they changed something else as well. They showed that Genesis was not simply copied, it was lived with. The people who preserved these texts did not treat Genesis as a closed story, resting silently on a shelf. They returned to it again and again. They asked questions the short biblical narratives left unanswered. Who exactly were the watchers? Why was Noah's birth so strange? What did Abraham see in Egypt? How should the calendar of creation govern human life? What happened in the gaps between the verses? Works like Jubilees and the Genesis Apocryphon did not replace Genesis. They responded to it. They stretched its brief scenes into longer narratives. They gave names to unnamed figures, speeches to silent characters, and order to events that Genesis mentions only in passing. They show ancient Jewish writers doing something deeply creative, treating Scripture as authoritative, while also treating it as a world large enough to explore. That is important because modern readers often imagine only two possibilities. Either a text is copied exactly word for word without discussion, or it is changed so completely that it becomes something else. The Qumran library shows a more complicated reality. Genesis could be copied with care. It could exist in slightly different textual forms. It could be translated, it could be interpreted through calendars, laws, angelic stories, and rewritten narratives. All of this could happen within the same broad world of ancient Jewish reverence for ancestral tradition. But the scrolls also leave us with limits. We do not possess every ancient copy of Genesis. We do not know how representative the Qumran collection was of all Jewish communities. Some fragments are too damaged to read with certainty. Some proposed reconstructions remain debated. A missing letter can change a word. A missing word can change a whole argument, and when only a corner of parchment survives, scholars must resist the temptation to build a complete lost book around it. So the central claim needs to be simple. The Dead Sea Scrolls do not prove that there was a hidden replacement, Genesis, kept from the world because it was too dangerous to read. What they reveal is something more historically real. Genesis had a longer, richer, and more varied manuscript history than earlier generations could see. Its text was both stable and still developing. Its stories were copied, debated, translated, expanded, and imagined anew by ancient readers who believed that the beginning of the world was not finished speaking. And somewhere beyond the surviving fragments, beyond the caves and broken lines of ink, there were other copies, other readers, and other interpretations that the desert did not preserve. And that may be the most haunting part of the story. The Dead Sea Scrolls survived because, for reasons we can only partly reconstruct, bundles of manuscripts were placed in caves above one of the harshest landscapes on earth. They lay in jars, in niches, in collapsed chambers, and beneath layers of dust and stone. For nearly 2,000 years the desert darkness kept them hidden. Not perfectly. Time had done its work. Parchment dried, curled, cracked, and broke into fragments. Ink faded. Rodents, moisture, insects, heat, and human disturbance all left their marks. Some scrolls survived in long columns. Others survived as tiny pieces no bigger than a fingernail. A single visible letter, the curve of a word, a line that ends before the sentence can tell us where it was going. And yet, enough remained, enough to show us that the ancient world of Genesis was larger than one manuscript, one community, or one settled way of reading. There were copies of Genesis itself, manuscripts written in Hebrew preserving the familiar stories of creation, flood, covenant, exile, and return. These copies often stand surprisingly close to the Hebrew text preserved in later Jewish tradition. That is one part of the Qumran story, and it matters. Across centuries of copying, the central shape of Genesis endured. But there were also variant textual traditions. Some ancient readings seem closer to the text later preserved by Samaritan communities. Some resemble forms known from the Greek Septuagint. Some appear to belong to textual lines that have no surviving descendants outside the caves. These were not necessarily rival books of Genesis battling for control of the ancient world. Usually the differences are smaller than that, but they remind us that the biblical text did not emerge from the desert as one frozen, uniform object. It moved through history in copies, and every copy had a history. Then there were the expanded retellings, works like Jubilees and the Genesis Apocryphon. These did not simply copy Genesis line by line. They entered its world. They slowed down scenes that Genesis tells quickly. They gave speeches to figures who had been silent. They organized time according to heavenly calendars. They explored Noah's strange birth, the world of angels and giants, Abraham's travels, Sarah's danger in Egypt, and the mysteries that seem to wait quietly between the biblical verses. So, when someone says the Dead Sea Scrolls contain a version of Genesis you were never meant to read, the truth is both less dramatic and more interesting. There was no single forbidden Genesis locked away because it threatened to destroy everything people thought they knew. There were ancient manuscripts, ancient variations, ancient translations, ancient interpretations, a whole library of people returning to the same stories and asking, what else is here? What did the first readers hear in these words? What questions did they carry into the text? What answers did they find? And what answers did they create? We should be careful here. The Qumran caves do not give us direct access to the first hand that ever wrote Genesis. They do not allow us to reconstruct every stage of the book's formation with certainty. We do not even know exactly why every scroll was brought to the caves, or whether the collection represents one community's library, material hidden during crisis, or a mixture of both. Scholars debate these questions because the evidence is incomplete. And incomplete evidence requires patience. That is not a weakness in the story. It is part of what makes the story real. History is not a sealed room where every answer waits behind the right door. More often it is a dark cave filled with broken pieces. A scholar reads a damaged line, another compares the handwriting. Someone tests the parchment. Someone else studies a Greek translation, a Samaritan manuscript, a medieval Hebrew codex, or a quotation preserved by an ancient writer. Slowly, cautiously, a picture begins to form. Then a new fragment appears. Or a new technology makes faded ink visible. Or an old assumption turns out to be too simple. And the picture changes again. Genesis itself has always invited that kind of return. It begins before human memory. It tells of a garden no one can locate, a flood remembered in many forms, ancestors who travel through landscapes at once familiar and unreachable. Its stories are brief enough to leave space around them. They give readers a beginning, but not every detail, and perhaps that is why generation after generation has entered those spaces. Ancient Jewish writers did it at Qumran. Samaritan scribes did it on their own sacred mountain. Greek-speaking Jewish communities did it around the Mediterranean. Later, Jewish, Christian, and Muslim readers did it in commentaries, sermons, poems, laws, and legends. And modern readers are still doing it now, still asking why the world began in this particular way, still wondering what the flood means, still looking at the strange figures at the edges of the story. Watchers, giants, wandering ancestors, dreams, blessings, betrayals, and promises that seem too large for any one family to carry. The Dead Sea Scrolls do not end those questions. They make them deeper. They remind us that a sacred text can be stable without being simple, that careful copying and creative interpretation can exist side by side, that ancient people just like us inherited stories they did not fully understand and refused to stop thinking about them. And perhaps, somewhere in the silence of those caves, that is what the fragile manuscripts still ask of us. Not to accept every dramatic claim, not to imagine secrets where the evidence gives us only fragments, but to look closely, to remain curious, to let uncertainty be honest, and to remember that the oldest stories are often still alive because they leave room for another question. If you enjoyed this journey into the Desert Library, please like, comment, and subscribe. And tell me where you are listening from tonight. The best way to support the channel is to listen on Spotify, with the link in the description.